Chapter 275. Seeing that Mo Jingshan clearly did not want to eat it, Jin Wan brought the biscuit closer to his mouth. Just one bite. The man had already given in to her childish actions countless times. This time, he unsurprisingly gave her face and ate the biscuit. How is it? Does it taste good? It's all right. Boss Missouri meant that it did not taste bad. It could also be interpreted as delicious. Mo Jingshan naturally knew that she was gloating right now and let her be. When the two of them walked out of the night market, it was already very late. The night market was very long. Although Jin Wan had brought daily clothes that could be used to change into her gown, she was still wearing the pair of high heels that matched her gown. Her feet were already aching when they ran out of the venue. After walking such a long night market, her feet were in so much pain that they did not feel like they belonged to her. Did you come straight to the venue after landing? Didn't you drive? Jin Wan looked at the crowd and cars at the end of the night market. It seemed like it was difficult to hail a taxi here, because there were too many people. I didn't drive. Then how are we going back? Jin Wan looked at the sea of people. There were almost no empty cabs. This was not T University. It was just a venue in the city center that T University had chosen to hold its 100-year anniversary celebration. From here to T University and the condominium, it would take at least half an hour to hail a taxi. However, it was impossible to hail a taxi here. There aren't many people at the plaza by the main entrance. It's more convenient to hail a taxi. The plaza by the main entrance. Jin Wan turned back to look in the direction of the venue. This place was already very far away. If they were to circle to the main entrance, she would see the long streets and streetlights in the distance. Her feet began to hurt even more. Mo Jingshan lowered his head to take a look. Your feet hurt. It's all right. These high heels that match the gown are slightly higher than normal shoes. It's not convenient to walk, Jin Wan answered casually. The man smiled mildly, seeing that she was clearly in so much pain that she did not have the courage to continue walking, yet still wanted to save her face. His thin lips curved into a light smile. It's not like I'll laugh at you if you say it hurts. Why are you still trying to act tough? What else can I do if I don't act tough? I can't possibly sleep on the streets, right? Furthermore, my apartment is in T-City, which isn't too far away. There's no need for me to stay in a nearby hotel. Besides, I don't have my ID card with me, so I can't even enter the hotel. Jin Wan carried the small bags in her hands and raised her leg, attempting to relieve the pain in the soles of her feet. And it's already so late. Even if I call your driver over, he's probably already resting. I'd better take a taxi. Before she could finish speaking, she suddenly paused, because the tall man had already squatted down in front of her. Come up. Jin Wan looked at the crowd around her, then at the square far away from the main entrance of the venue, and then at the man squatting in front of her. Her lips curved into a sweet smile, and without a word, she leaned over his back. Mo Jingshan carried her on his back, striding forward. His steps were neither fast nor slow, steady and orderly. Jin Wan wrapped her arms around his neck and pressed her face against the back of his neck. Have you carried anyone before? There was a hint of amusement in the man's voice. Of course not. Your fiancée in America didn't carry her either. Did she? No. Jin Wan wanted to ask more, but she remembered that he had previously returned to America to resolve this matter. Right now there was indeed no need to mention this person, although she still did not know who that American woman was. She rubbed her face against his ear, asking softly, Am I heavy? He smiled mildly. How heavy do you think you are? I usually eat quite a lot. Previously, I ate so much that I almost thought I was really pregnant. My weight must have increased by a few pounds. As she spoke, she hugged his neck tightly and lowered her eyes to look at the cheap white t-shirt in the bag in her hands. That was the t-shirt she often wore in her previous life, when she was so poor that she could not even afford to buy clothes that cost 100 yuan. She asked softly, You're so good to me. You don't even let me experience the slightest bit of pain and suffering. I'm almost spoiled to the point of becoming a glass princess, the kind that will shatter the moment I touch the ground. After a moment of silence, the man smiled mildly. By my side, what you don't need to experience the most is the pain and suffering of the world. Jin Wan murmured, Is this an honor that only belongs to Mrs. Mo? It belongs to you. It belongs to Jinwan. Jinwan leaned against the man's shoulder, her lips curling up. Belong to her? The woman pressed her face against the man's, whispering against his warmth. So why is it me? He did not speak. Mo Jingshan. N. On the long street at night. The two had already walked far away from the liveliness of the night market. However, there were still cars passing by quickly. The distance between the quiet and the liveliness seemed to have been separated by the two of them. The world was vast, but the only thing in her world was his warm back. You must have secretly fallen for me when I wasn't aware of it, right? Otherwise, how could you have agreed to marry me so easily? And how could you have always treated me so well? The tall and straight man smiled. He did not reply, and continued to walk forward with her on his back. You've been carrying me for so long. Are you tired? And tired? Then let me get down and walk by myself. It's not far from here to the plaza. The man did not put her down. Instead, his grip on her body tightened. Lie down properly. Don't move. You already said you're tired. You haven't stopped talking the entire way. I'm tired from chatting with you. He actually disliked her for talking too much. When the two returned home, Jinwan rushed to change out of her shoes. Only then did she feel much more relaxed. After showering, Mo Jingshan lowered his head to kiss her face. Wan. And my flight is back to High City tomorrow morning. I'll be flying overseas the day after. After pausing for several seconds, he calmly added, I'll be back soon. When you finish your classes next week, I'll come straight to T-City to pick you up. Jinwan nodded. After a moment, she hesitantly made a no sound. She felt that most of the things Mo Jingshan was busy with were not in the country. Furthermore, it had been a long time since she heard any news about Nanheng. Feng Ling's lips were also tightly sealed. She did not know what exactly Mo Jingshan was busy with. I'm worried about you returning to High City alone. Be good and stay in the condo for the next few days. Wait for me to come back next week. Have Feng Ling pack your things, and I'll come to pick you up, N? Jinwan did not question further. All right. Chapter 276. Jinwan nodded obediently. For some strange reason, she felt that Mo Jingshan's words today were much more than any other time. Where are you flying to this time? America? Or Japan? She asked subconsciously. He touched her hair and said softly, When I come back, I'll bring you a local gift. You'll know. A few days later, Jinwan received a call from Ji Hongwen. It had been 10 days since Ji Minggran disappeared. Ji Hongwen's voice was lower and older than usual. He didn't sound too depressed, but Jinwan knew that he hadn't been eating or sleeping well recently. Today was the anniversary of Jinwan's mother's death. It had been so many years, and the sadness had been covered by time. Jinwan habitually looked at the sky for a long time on this day. And then she received a call from Ji Hongwen. Wan, Dad knows that you don't want to ask me too much because of Minggran. There are many truths that I plan to hide from you for the rest of my life. You will always be my daughter, and I'm not going to tell you those things until I die. If you don't want to tell me, I won't force you. Jinwan replied. I don't plan to find my biological father or recognize him as my biological father. And now Minggran's matter is pressing on your heart. You don't need to. It doesn't matter. Now that things have come to this point, deliberately hiding it will only cause harm. Your mother has been gone for many years. I couldn't hide what she told me. I didn't expect that Minggran would know and come to you to slander you. Ji Hongwen sighed heavily. Before your mother married me, she had a past. It was a past that she was forced into. She didn't love your biological father. Back then, I was also a young man who sacrificed my life for love. Even though your mother was pregnant, I still married her without hesitation. I promised to treat you as my own daughter. Wan, I watched you grow up. This father-daughter relationship is no different from the relationship between me and Minggran. Do you understand? I understand, Dad. Jinwan didn't expect that after so many days of silence, Ji Hongwen finally decided to tell her the truth. Now the burden on her heart was much lighter. At least she was no longer the only one who was kept in the dark. As for who your biological father is, maybe you will never meet him again in this life. Even if you meet him, I'm afraid he will never know of your existence. I don't intend to repeat these old stories too much. After all, it happened more than 20 years ago. And it's all about your mother's resentment. It has nothing to do with you. Wan, I don't know. Jin Wan's eyes were filled with tears. Dad, I've never denied your existence. We are the same as before. I won. And you won. And Ji won. And you won, right? Jin Wan's eyes welled up with tears. Dad, I've never denied your existence. We're still the same as before. I won't change and you won't change, right? Yes. Ji Hongwen's voice was a bit hoarse from excitement. Good girl, I know Minggran is wrong. She has made many mistakes, and I have never been biased towards anyone. However, I have not heard from her for a long time. My mood has been affected, but I don't mean to ignore you. You are always my most beloved daughter. I know. Jin Wan's nose felt sour. She raised her hand to rub it, trying not to choke. She knew that Ji Hongwen had deliberately chosen this day to make things clear to her. Fortunately, there had never been any deep estrangement between father and daughter. Between people, the most terrible thing was to say nothing. Ji Hongwen said a few more words before hanging up. Jin Wan held her phone and stood by the window, looking out for a long time. Who was her biological father? Perhaps she would never meet him in this lifetime. Even if they met, the other party wouldn't know of her existence? When her mother was young, she was a very quiet and gentle woman. Jin Wan was too young to know much about her mother's past, but she really couldn't figure out how she could have been forced to marry someone before she got married. What kind of coercion was it? Was she forced to marry by force, or was she forced to marry by her elders? Or were there other possibilities? Ji Hongwen clearly did not intend to talk about these things. He only called to comfort her and tell her that nothing would change between them. He wanted to keep her as his daughter, and Jin Wan also wanted to keep the family she had lived in since she was young. Professor Lin's class only lasted for 3 months. This class ended before T University's graduation season. Although the short 3 months was not as long as other people's years, Jin Wan could be considered to have made a friend like Bai Wei. On the eve of their departure, the students in Professor Lin's class had a rare gathering. Although Feng Ling was a transfer student, she went along. Jin Wan did not drink. She sat on the sofa and chatted with Bai Wei. She talked about her experiences in the past 3 months, and the possibility of working with Bai Wei's company in the future. Feng Ling had never participated in such an occasion before. She only occasionally looked at her phone and watched Jin Wan, not allowing her to drink. This class had a simple beginning and a simple ending. However, the process was exciting. Ling Feifei kept avoiding Jin Wan and sat far away from her. Feng Ling would occasionally raise her brows and glance at Ling Feifei, intentionally using her gaze to scare her. Ling Feifei was so frightened that she quickly used the excuse of feeling unwell to slip away. She did not dare to stay any longer. Jin Wan left T University with the results of her final test. The next day, she packed her luggage with Feng Ling in the condominium. Mo Jingshan said that he would pick her up and bring her back to High City today. She did not know if he would fly directly to T City or return to High City first before coming over. Jin Wan did not have much luggage, but it took her a long time to pack. She waited from dawn until afternoon, but Mo Jingshan did not appear. For the entire day, she did not receive any calls from Mo Jingshan. What time is it? Jin Wan locked the 2 suitcases and stood up, clapping her hands as she asked Feng Ling in the living room. It's past 5, Feng Ling replied. Only then did Jin Wan notice the passage of time. She turned to see that it was already evening, and picked up her phone to look at the time. There were only messages from Xia Tian and Xiaoba on her phone. They asked if she was returning to High City today or tomorrow, and said that they wanted to arrange a welcome banquet for her. Her messages were bustling with activity. Many people had sent her various messages. However, there was no news from Mo Jingshan. Time passed bit by bit. 6 o'clock. Mo Jingshan did not appear, nor did he call. 7 o'clock. There was still no sign of Mo Jingshan. At 10 o'clock, her phone was silent. There was no sound of anyone opening the door. Jin Wan tried to call Mo Jingshan, but all she heard was a cold, robotic female voice indicating that the other party was not in the service area and could not be reached. Chapter 277. If Mo Jingshan was too busy to fly here these days, Jinwan could fly back to High City herself. But why didn't he call her? Jinwan waited until midnight, but there was no news. She thought maybe Mo Jingshan was on the plane back from abroad, and the flight was a little long. She didn't get a call or a person, so she had to take a shower and go to sleep. The next morning, at 6 o'clock, suddenly, Feng Ling's cell phone rang. Jinwan heard her cell phone ringing. Although it was not her cell phone, she sat up abruptly. Feng Ling was sleeping in the guest room next door. When Jinwan pushed the door open, she was already answering the phone, but her expression was serious and deep. Usually, Feng Ling rarely showed her joy on the surface. In an instant, Jinwan instinctively felt something was wrong. After answering the phone, Feng Ling put down the phone and looked up at Jinwan, who was standing at the door of the guest room. "Mrs. Mo, why did you get up so early?" Feng Ling fixed her eyes on her, and after 2 seconds of silence, she asked calmly, "I couldn't sleep. I heard some noise here, so I came to have a look." Jinwan walked in and opened the curtains for her. She asked casually, "Who called so early in the morning?" "A brother who used to work at 11 base." Feng Ling's eyes were hidden in the morning light after the curtains were opened, and she looked at the time. "CEO Mo must be busy and can't come for the time being. Let's go to the airport now and return to High City today." Jinwan's hand paused on the curtains, and after a moment of silence, she turned to look at Feng Ling. "Feng Ling, tell me the truth. Did something happen?" Feng Ling didn't answer and got out of bed. "Let's have breakfast first. Mr. Mo said you must eat on time every day. Shall we order takeout or call the aunt to cook? Anyway, I don't know how to cook, and I don't think you can eat the food I cook. Tell me the truth. No matter what happens, I shouldn't be the one being kept from you." Jinwan stared at Feng Ling's back and raised her voice, not giving her a chance to avoid it. Feng Ling paused and turned to look at Jinwan. "Mrs. Mo, I believe Mr. Mo will come back. All you have to do now is to return to High City safely." "What happened to him?" Hearing the words, "I believe Mr. Mo will come back," Jinwan's heart sank instinctively. Feng Ling would not easily say such words. Feng Ling looked at her for a moment and said, "Mr. Mo flew to Cambodia a few days ago. It's not peaceful there recently, and there are some gangsters lurking around there. Mr. Mo has lost contact with our people, and we can't find his location or signal. We only know that a group of border arms dealers also went there before the accident. I don't know if they met." Jinwan stared at Feng Ling calmly. It took her a long time to digest her words and understand them in her heart. A gang that had a grudge in the United States? Mo Jingshan was a member of the Mo family. His foundation was so stable, and his business history had always been clean. There was no need for him to have any connections with the underworld. What exactly did he do in America in the past? Why would he go to Cambodia? Danger lurks in every corner of that place, and every step is dangerous. Landmines can be seen everywhere. The whole world knows about this. What's he doing there? "Mrs. Mo, I'm sorry. When Mr. Mo comes back, he will answer you in person. It's not convenient for me to say too much." Feng Ling answered softly. "But please believe me, as you said, Mr. Mo has always been clean. He has no dark history, but many years ago in the United States, the situation is a bit complicated. Although he didn't personally involve himself in the underworld, in the eyes of the gangsters and the competitors of 11 Base, Mr. Mo's life is worth tens of billions. They won't kill him easily, but if they really set up an ambush, they won't let him go easily. So you mean he can't come back now?" Feng Ling paused and looked at her. "Mr. Mo is missing. The people of the base have now gone to search and rescue, but no one knows what happened to Mr. Mo. He had lost contact with the signal before the accident." "What are you talking about? It's impossible. He said he just went abroad on a business trip." Jinwan suddenly turned back to the bedroom, picked up her cell phone, and called Mo Jingshan. "Sorry, the number you have dialed is temporarily unavailable. Please try again later." Jinwan frowned slightly and continued to call Mo Jingshan's other numbers. She called his work cell phone number, his private cell phone number, and the cell phone number that he didn't use often. His cell phone was either turned off, unavailable, Or not in the service area. Seeing Jinwan still on the phone, Feng Ling went up to her. Our people have gone to find him. Mr. Mo will definitely come back safely. Mrs. Mo, let's go back to High City first. I'll go back with you. Jinwan tried to calm down and looked up at her. He asked me to wait for him to come back. He said he would come to pick me up after returning to China. Mo Jingshan never breaks his promise. I'll stay here and wait for him. He may be on the plane back home, or he may have landed at the airport of T-City. I'll wait for him. Feng Ling wanted to persuade her, but seeing that Jinwan was obviously restraining all her emotions, she knew she couldn't push her too hard at this time. So she said, okay, then let's wait. I'll wait with you. Jinwan didn't speak anymore. She just sat on the sofa holding her cell phone, but her eyes were fixed on the door. Half an hour later, there was a sudden movement outside the door, and then the doorbell rang. Jinwan stood up abruptly and walked quickly to the door. The moment she opened the door, her face lit up with joy, only to see that the person standing outside was a very strange middle-aged man. Miss, this is the breakfast takeout you just ordered. The middle-aged man smiled politely at her and handed her 2 bags with lunch boxes in them. Jinwan's expression froze in an instant. Feng Ling walked out quickly, took the takeout, paid the money, and took Jinwan back into the room, closing the door. This is the takeout I just ordered. Mrs. Mo, you can wait here if you want, but you have to eat something. I'm not hungry. You can eat. Jinwan walked back to the sofa and sat down. This is Mr. Mo's order. You have to eat breakfast. I'm really not hungry. Chapter 278. Jinwan took another look at her and had to get up, walk to the dining table, and sit down. Feng Ling opened the bag and took out the soybean milk and steamed buns from the lunchbox. I knew you probably didn't have an appetite, so I bought 2 kinds of steamed buns with stuffing. One is beef and onion, and the other is vegetable zucchini and egg. You have to eat some. Jinwan didn't speak, took a sip of the soybean milk, and took a bite of a steamed bun. As soon as she took a bite, a very fragrant and strong taste of beef filled her mouth. Jinwan suddenly felt nauseous, stood up, rushed into the bathroom, and retched against the toilet. Mrs. Mo? Feng Ling was startled. She put down the cutlery in her hand and stood up to follow. She saw that Jinwan did not vomit much, but her stomach was obviously uncomfortable, and she kept retching. She rushed to pour a glass of water and handed it to Jinwan when she stood up. Why do you suddenly feel nauseous? Where do you feel uncomfortable? Do you want to see a doctor? Feng Ling stared at her with concern. I'm fine. I've often had stomach discomfort since I first came to T-City. Maybe I was too nervous just now. Jinwan rinsed her mouth, washed her face with cold water, and returned to the dining table. Looking at the steamed buns, she really had no appetite, and the beef filling was even more disgusting. It was fragrant and clean, but it was disgusting. She didn't want to eat the steamed bun with vegetable filling either. In the end, she only drank half a cup of soybean milk, and then covered her stomach that kept tossing and turning, saying, I really can't drink anymore. If I drink any more, I'll probably throw up. Seeing that Jinwan really couldn't eat or drink, Feng Ling saw her drink half a cup of soybean milk and didn't force her. Then go back to the bedroom and lie down. I'll buy you some stomach medicine, okay? No, I'll be fine in a minute. Let's talk about it when we go back to High City. Jinwan returned to the sofa and sat down, which was facing the door, stubbornly sitting there and looking at the quiet door. From morning to afternoon, Mo Jingshan didn't appear. Jinwan leaned against the sofa, holding a pillow, and picked up her cell phone again to make a call. His cell phone was still turned off, and no one answered. She let out a long breath and looked at the quiet door. Mrs. Mo, is your stomach better now? Feng Ling avoided the topic of Mo Jingshan and sat by her side to ask softly. Jinwan didn't answer. After a long silence, she said calmly, Feng Ling, let's go back to High City. Feng Ling paused, looked at Jinwan's calm face and nodded. All right, I'll book a ticket. Jinwan did not speak anymore. She leaned against the sofa and looked up at the apartment she had lived in for 3 months. From the apartment to the airport, from boarding the plane to landing in High City, Jinwan did not say a word. When she walked out of High City Airport, a silver-gray Porsche was parked outside. It was obviously here to pick her up. When Jinwan came back, she didn't call a car, nor did she tell the Ji family and the Mo family which flight she was taking. Why was there a car to pick her up? She turned to look at Feng Ling. Feng Ling said, "It's not convenient to inform the Mo family about Mr. Mo's matter now. I called Dr. Qin before boarding the plane and told him that your stomach was not feeling well this morning. I was worried that you might get airsick today, so I asked Dr. Qin to find time to come over. He's not busy today, so he drove directly to the airport." Qin sighting? Jinwan paused and did not say more. As soon as she walked to the side of the car, the driver's door was opened. Qin sighting was not wearing the white hospital gown, but only a light-colored shirt and trousers. After getting out of the car, he glanced at her and still had that sloppy smile on his face. He raised his eyebrows at her. "Oh, Mrs. Mo, you've returned from your studies. Your temperament seems different. You have the posture of a future business manager. In the future, if those old men in the Qin family's company compete with your studio for business, I'm afraid they won't be able to defeat you, Mrs. Mo. Dr. Qin. You're so busy in the hospital, but I still asked you to come to pick me up. I'm sorry to trouble you." Jinwan nodded politely at him. "What trouble? Put the luggage there. Get in the car." Qin sighting did not say more. He gestured for Jinwan to get in the car and walked around the car to carry their luggage to the trunk with Feng Ling. Jinwan originally wanted to carry the luggage herself, but the two's movements were nimble and quick. Her hands were empty, so she did not insist and directly sat in the back of the car. Seeing that Jinwan was obviously not interested, Qin sighting closed the trunk behind her and glanced at Feng Ling. "She knows everything?" Feng Ling answered, "I can't hide too much, but Mrs. Mo seems calm. I just don't know how she is feeling right now." "Calm?" Qin sighting snorted. "It would be strange if she's calm, but it's indeed a good thing that she doesn't make people worry on the surface. At this time, if she can't even control her own emotions, who can help her? In this world, only Mo Jingshan can completely take care of all her emotions and feelings. Now that Mo Jingshan is not here, she can only rely on herself." As he spoke, Qin sighting walked to the side of the car and knocked on the back window. Jinwan lowered the window and turned to look at him. "Dr. Qin, Feng Ling said that you vomited after eating a bite of the bun this morning. What happened?" "It's all right. I'm fine now. Anyway, it's on the way back to the U Garden. We'll pass by our hospital on the way. I'll take you to the hospital for a checkup first. There's no need to go through so much trouble. Just go straight to the U Garden." Qin sighting did not pay any more attention to her. He opened the front door and sat in the driver's seat. Feng Ling also sat in the car and turned to look at her. "It's good to go to the hospital for a checkup. Otherwise, I'll really be worried." She just vomited a little. What was there to be worried about? In the past, when she vomited, Jinwan thought she was pregnant. Now she did not even consider this possibility. So what? At most, her stomach would feel uncomfortable. Jinwan did not say more. After all, Qin sighting came to pick her up. If he wanted to take her to the hospital first, she would go to the hospital first. She could not force him to send her back to the U Garden. She could not get out of the car halfway, so she could only follow them. In the car, Qin sighting glanced at the time. As he drove, he glanced at Jinwan through the rearview mirror. "He will come back. Don't worry too much. Nanheng has already sent people over. There are dangers everywhere in that kind of place. Right now, we can't be sure if he was ambushed or something else. Don't panic." Jinwan was silent for a moment and then said, "I don't even know what he used to do in America. I don't even know where to panic. What else can I do?" Qin sighting snorted. "The ignorant are fearless. This is a good thing." "The ignorant are fearless? You mean the situation is more dangerous and urgent than I thought?" Jinwan looked up at him. Chapter 279. When they arrived at the hospital, Qin sighting motioned for Feng Ling to accompany Jinwan to have a blood test. It was already past 9 o'clock in the evening, and the doctors in the hospital had already left work. Only a few doctors on duty were surprised to see Qin sighting enter the door in casual clothes. Usually, Dr. Qin rarely came to the hospital during his rest time. But because of Qin's sighting, the doctors on duty quickly did several tests for Jinwan. Finally, when Jinwan walked to Qin Sighting's office with several test results, she suddenly heard Qin Sighting's voice coming from his office. Still no news? He has been missing for a day. According to his character, this kind of thing can't happen. There must be something unexpected. We'd better find him within 24 hours, or I'm afraid his life will be in danger. Hearing these words outside the door, Jinwan paused her hand on the door and did not immediately push it open. Then Qin Sighting's tone softened a lot. I'll take care of him at home. Jinwan has arrived in High City. She is calm. Feng Ling will accompany her. Then he gave some instructions. When Jinwan knocked on the door, Qin Sighting hung up the phone. Have the results of the tests I asked you to do come out? Qin Sighting turned his eyes to Jinwan, who came in. Jinwan nodded, walked over, and handed him the test results, asking, "What do the HCG values on them mean?" Qin Sighting hadn't seen the page she was talking about. The moment he heard Jinwan's words, he raised his eyebrows and abruptly pulled out the page. He glanced at it, and then looked up at Jinwan. When was your last period? She couldn't treat Qin Sighting as Mo Jingshan's best friend. He was a doctor. It was normal for him to ask this kind of question. About a month ago. As soon as she answered this, Jinwan's expression suddenly froze. Her period should have come 2 days ago, but it was 2 days late. She was usually very punctual. A positive HCG value means that you are pregnant, Mrs. Mo. Qin Sighting looked at her with a smile in his eyes. Jinwan looked at him in surprise. What? Your HCG value is very standard. It's neither too high nor too low. It should be able to rule out ectopic pregnancy. I'll go to the obstetrics and gynecology department later. If there's no problem, your vomiting is just a reflection of early pregnancy. Qin Sighting glanced at her other test results, turned to the computer, and helped her register for the gynecology and obstetrics department. He then turned to look at her, only to see that Jinwan was standing there, as if she had not reacted. What are you standing there for? He raised his eyebrows. I'm really. Jinwan looked at him in disbelief. Pregnant? Qin Sighting glanced at her with a smile. Do you think the laboratory in the hospital is a decoration? You haven't been pregnant for long. Judging from the time when your last period ended, it's only about 3 or 4 weeks. We can only find out through a blood test, but you're indeed pregnant. I just went to the hospital for a checkup more than 3 weeks ago. At that time, I was prescribed a lot of traditional Chinese medicine because my uterus was cold. Of course, you couldn't find anything 3 weeks ago. You're pregnant from the last period. And the traditional Chinese medicine to warm the uterus worked on you. Besides, during the period when you took the traditional Chinese medicine, you and Mo Jingshan should have slept together more than once. Jinwan. Indeed, they slept together more than once. Relatively speaking, they slept together very frequently. So just when she thought it might take a long time for her to conceive a child, she happened to be pregnant in those few days? It was a joy that she should be excited to share. But at this moment, there was no one around to share it with her. After Jinwan went to the obstetrics and gynecology department, she did several related tests and finally confirmed that she was indeed pregnant, and it was early pregnancy. Because of the cold uterus, her body was more sensitive, and the pregnancy symptoms came earlier than most people, and her morning sickness was more serious. When Jinwan walked out of the clinic, Feng Ling looked at her with concern. Mrs. Mo, are you really pregnant? Yes, she was really pregnant. But where was Mo Jingshan? Where was the father of her child? She left the hospital and returned to the Yu Garden. As usual, Auntie Chen came out to welcome her. When she saw that it was Jinwan, she immediately called the other servants to help her with her luggage and accompanied her upstairs, asking her how she had been in Tea City in the past few months. It had only been 3 months, but it seemed that nothing had changed. The Yu Garden was still the warm Yu Garden, and Auntie Chen was still the enthusiastic Auntie Chen. The furnishings in the bedroom hadn't changed, and her wardrobe hadn't changed much since she left. Mrs. Mo, why did you choose to come back at this time? It's already midnight. Are you hungry? Do you want me to make you some supper? Auntie Chen smiled. No, it's late. Auntie Chen, go to bed first. We'll talk about it tomorrow. Jinwan replied gently, then walked to the window, opened it, and looked out at the falling snow. It was early winter when she left. It didn't seem to snow at that time, but now the 2,000 square meter garden and swimming pool in the U Garden were covered with pure white snow. Auntie Chen thought that Jinwan was too tired and sleepy after a day's flight, so she didn't dare to disturb her and went out. Feng Ling waited outside the door and didn't enter the bedroom until Auntie Chen left. I'll stay in the U Garden to accompany you. There are many guest rooms here. Call me if you need anything. You've been tired all day. Go to rest. Jinwan's voice was very light, and she stood in front of the window without moving. The room was quiet again. Jinwan looked out of the window for a long time, until the winter wind was cold. She closed the window and turned back to the bed. The moment she sat down, she lay down. The quilt seemed to still have Mo Jingshan's smell, which was enough to prove that he would come back to the U Garden to stay after finishing his work in the company, before going abroad. Jinwan turned over on the bed, buried her face in the quilt, and took a deep breath. It was very light and clean, as if Mo Jingshan was lying next to her. She was sleepy but didn't want to sleep. Jinwan picked up her cell phone and texted Mo Jingshan. Jinwan, you said to wait for you to come back. You said you would take me back to High City. Jinwan. Mo Jingshan, you can't break your promise. Jinwan. Where are you? The text message was sent out like a stone sinking into the sea. Both her and Mo Jingshan's cell phones had been read and unread settings. After half an hour, she didn't receive a read receipt from these text messages. Jinwan's nose turned sour. She had just put down her cell phone when all of a sudden, the phone in her hand vibrated. Chapter 280. Jinwan abruptly lowered her head to look at the number displayed on the screen. The moment she saw it was really Mo Jingshan's number, she jumped up from the bed and quickly picked up the phone. Hello. The call went through. Jinwan could hear the sound of the call being connected, but it was very quiet on the other side of the phone. She could vaguely hear the sound of breathing, which seemed to be a little far from the phone. Hello, Jingshan. Jinwan clenched the phone. Where are you? Are you? Beep. The call was suddenly cut off in less than 5 seconds. Jinwan froze and looked at the phone again. The call had been hung up. The total time of the call was 4 seconds. For some reason, Jinwan's heart suddenly beat faster. Staring at the short call record, she suddenly rushed out of the bedroom, ran to the door of the guest room where Feng Ling was, and began to knock hard on the door. Feng Ling thought something had happened. When she opened the door, her sharp eyes glanced outside, but when she saw Jinwan's expression, as if something urgent had happened, she subconsciously walked out and looked behind her. What's wrong? What happened? Call Feng Ling, Mo Jingshan just called me. Jinwan pointed at the phone. Just now, a minute ago. Feng Ling looked at her in surprise, and suddenly took her phone. Sure enough, she saw the call record. After a moment of hesitation, she decisively turned back to the room to pick up her own phone and make a call. Jinwan followed her in and saw that Feng Ling had informed her of the call Mo Jingshan had just made to her. Then Feng Ling's phone suddenly received a software that Jinwan had never seen before. Feng Ling connected the phone to the computer, installed the software, and quickly took the phone in her hand and connected it to the computer. Jinwan stood aside and stared at the white map on the black screen of the computer. On a small map below, there was a striking red dot that flickered bit by bit until the red dot signal gradually weakened and disappeared. The moment Feng Ling saw the red dot, she made another call. I found Mr. Mo's location a few minutes ago. He is in the area about 5 kilometers east of Tunnel Sap Lake in Cambodia. The coordinates are accurate, and the signal has disappeared again. After the call, Feng Ling raised her eyes to look at Jinwan. Thank you for your quick reaction. Before Mr. Mo's cell phone signal was blocked again, we found his last signal. Now our people will be there soon. Mr. Mo will come back safely. Jinwan looked at the small map on her computer screen that no longer had a red dot. It was indeed a map of Cambodia. He called just now, but he didn't say anything. He hung up after a few seconds. Are you sure he's safe? Jinwan stared at Feng Ling's face. If he's safe, why did he suddenly call me without saying a word? Why did the signal disappear so quickly? Mr. Mo's current location is a minefield. It's a place that even the Cambodian government can't control. That place is occupied and surrounded by drug gangs from various countries all year round. It's covered with a shielded network. No signal can be displayed there. Mr. Mo suddenly called you. Is it because you did something? Or, before Feng Ling could finish, Jinwan glanced at her cell phone again. The 2 messages she had sent to Mo Jingshan earlier showed that they had been read. I sent him a message, and he saw it. Jinwan raised her eyes to look at her. Feng Ling took her cell phone again, looked at it, and said, maybe Mr. Mo happened to leave the shielded network when you sent the message, but now we're not sure where he will go or where he will be taken. We have to find him immediately. Now we have people in Cambodia. Trust me, have a good sleep tonight and wait for our news. Rest assured? How could she rest assured? Jinwan pretended to be calm and didn't bring too much pressure to Feng Ling. She just turned back to her room with her cell phone. Mrs. Mo, leave your cell phone with me. If Mr. Mo can still keep in touch with you, I can check the signal immediately. All right. Jinwan gave her the cell phone and walked out of the guest room. When she returned to the bedroom, Jinwan looked at the empty room where she was alone. Her ears seemed to be echoing with the faint breathing sound that seemed to be a little far away in the 4 seconds when she picked up the phone. What kind of circumstances did he make this call under? Jinwan leaned against the door, closed her eyes, and tried to hold back the tears that were about to burst out. She couldn't think too much about it. Since he could see her text message, since he could call her, it proved that he was still alive. In a place like Cambodia, he was still alive. He would be safe. Jinwan returned to the bed, but she kept hearing the quiet, shallow breathing sound on the other side of the phone. At night, the cold wind rustled outside the window. Jinwan turned over, but still didn't fall asleep. Before dawn, Jinwan, who hadn't been able to fall asleep, suddenly heard something outside. She lifted the quilt and got up. She walked to the bedroom door and was about to open it when she heard a low voice outside. Miss Feng, there's a car outside looking for you. They specially told us not to wake up Mrs. Mo. It was Auntie Chen's voice. Got it. Feng Ling's voice was low. I may not be here for a few days. Take good care of Mrs. Mo. And ask 2 more people to accompany her. Don't let her wander around. It's best to let her stay in the U garden and wait for our news. Are you going out? Why are you in such a hurry? What happened, Miss Feng? Nothing, but Mrs. Mo is pregnant now. Remember not to let her wander around. Yesterday, she was found to be pregnant in the hospital. Recently, she needs all kinds of nutrition. It's already so late. I'm going out. Hurry up and make breakfast for her. Feng Ling's voice was low. Mrs. Mo is pregnant? God, I didn't know it until now. Mrs. Mo didn't mention it when she came back last night. Okay. I'll go prepare the pregnancy supplements for her right away. Okay, the car outside this morning. Don't tell anyone. When Mrs. Mo wakes up and finds I'm gone, just say that I went out to deal with something, and we'll be back soon. Don't let her worry. Okay, I understand, Miss Feng. Then there was the sound of the 2 of them walking down the stairs at the same time. Occasionally, Auntie Chen asked about Jinwan's pregnancy, and Feng Ling basically answered every question. When the 2 of them had gone downstairs, they could no longer be heard. Where was Feng Ling going? She had specially said these words. Obviously, she wouldn't stay in High City for a while. Chapter 281. Jinwan decisively put on her clothes and followed her out. When she went downstairs, Feng Ling had already gone outside the U garden. Auntie Chen happened to enter the kitchen at this time and didn't see Jinwan, who came downstairs at this time. Mrs. Mo? The other 2 servants didn't know what Feng Ling had told them. Seeing Jinwan come down, they greeted her eagerly. Jinwan signaled them not to make a sound, and while Auntie Chen didn't notice her, she quietly went out. The servants were a little confused, but Jinwan was the hostess of the U garden after all. No matter how careful and sneaky she was when she went out, they didn't dare to ask. Jinwan hid in the yard of the U garden, and saw Feng Ling get into the black car outside the gate. When the car drove away, Jinwan took a look at the direction it left, turned around, and glanced at the other cars in the garage. Feng Ling had always been very sensitive. If she rashly followed it, she would soon be discovered. Half an hour later, with the excuse that the Ji family had some friendship with the leaders of the high-city traffic police, Jinwan asked them to help track the road and direction of Feng Ling's car. Finally, she confirmed that the car went straight to the airport after leaving the Yu Garden. Jinwan decisively drove to the airport. When she arrived, she was half an hour behind the car in front of her. After entering the airport, she took out a pair of sunglasses large enough to cover half of her face from her bag, and put them on. Then she raised her collar high to cover her chin and a small part of her face. She quickly looked around the crowd and went straight to the passage that international flights needed to pass. Sure enough, Feng Ling was going abroad. From a distance, Jinwan saw Feng Ling was applying for boarding passes with several people dressed in black. Jinwan glanced at the flight number displayed on the counter and checked it with her cell phone. It was a direct flight from High City to Cambodia in 2 hours. Jinwan stood far away from the crowd. After Feng Ling and those people entered the security passage, she quickly walked to the counter, asked if there were any extra seats on this flight, bought a ticket for the same flight, and then quietly passed the security check and entered the first-class lounge. Feng Ling and those people bought business economy class tickets and were in the lounge outside, which happened to be a distance away from the lounge where Jinwan was. Jinwan looked out and could clearly see the crowd walking back and forth outside. But from the lounge outside, she couldn't see what was going on inside. "Hello, do you need anything to drink?" A staff member in the lounge came over and asked eagerly. Jinwan looked out again and saw that Feng Ling had bought a few bread and mineral water casually, which was enough to show that they were really in a hurry. Jinwan waved her hand to show that she didn't need it. She didn't make any sound. After all, Feng Ling was too sensitive. She was worried that she would be discovered if she made any sound. The staff member didn't ask any more and put the standard fresh fruit plate and some delicate biscuits in the lounge here. While waiting, Jinwan took into account that she was pregnant, so she simply ate some fruits and biscuits. Before the boarding notice, while Feng Ling got up to go to the bathroom, Jinwan quickly walked out. Because she was in first class, and because she was pregnant, she could board the plane first. She didn't have to wait in line, and successfully avoided Feng Ling's sight. During the 5-hour flight, Jinwan stayed in the first-class cabin and didn't go to the back. When the plane landed smoothly at the Phnom Penh International Airport in the capital of Cambodia, she couldn't hold back the morning sickness that she had endured for several hours. When everyone was lining up to go out, Jinwan suddenly retched and raised her hand to cover her mouth. At this time, a flight attendant passing by noticed her situation and specially asked her to get off the plane first. Feng Ling and the others were walking in the front and happened to stop in the first-class cabin. Hearing the conversation, Feng Ling glanced to the side from the corner of her eyes. She suddenly froze and turned to look at Jinwan, who was quickly putting on her sunglasses. Feng Ling, slow down." Jinwan was pulled all the way from the exit of the airport to the departure hall by Feng Ling. She held her wrist tightly and couldn't break free. Feng Ling walked and said seriously, "It's too dangerous here. You can't follow me. Go back to High City immediately. There is a direct flight back to High City this evening. Go back directly. Mo Jingshan is here. I can't go back unless I see him standing here safe and sound in front of me today. I won't go back. Mrs. Mo. Feng Ling, I won't make trouble or hold you back. But if you were me, would you stay in High City at ease?" Feng Ling's expression stiffened. Her gaze softened, and she softened her voice. "I'm not afraid of you causing trouble. Although the capital of Cambodia appears to be safe, the overall situation in this country is not very optimistic. The area around Tunnel Sap Lake is a place where landmines, guns, and drugs coexist. Not to mention that you're pregnant. Even if you weren't, you shouldn't come here." Jinwan didn't speak, but just looked at her. Seeing Jinwan's eyes, Feng Ling frowned. "I know you can't wait in High City at ease, but Mrs. Mo, this place is completely different from the life you are used to in China. Do you understand the essential difference between peaceful coexistence and bloody killing? But Emojingxian is here. Jinwan's voice was not loud, but every word she said was firm. Fengling looked at her for a long time, and her frown slowly relaxed. It seemed that she couldn't bear to drive Jinwan away, but she really couldn't let her stay in such a dangerous place. Mr. Emo won't want you to step into this kind of place, and you have to protect your child. There may be a war here at any time, Fengling said softly. Although I should listen to you, please listen to me this time and go back, okay? Jinwan looked at her quietly and didn't say anything more. She turned her eyes to the sky outside the airport. She was now standing on the same land as Emojingxian. She didn't want to make things difficult for Fengling. In the morning, when she came here, she just wanted to make sure if Fengling was really coming to Cambodia. At that time, she was already at the airport, and the documents in her bag happened to be with her. Jinwan just wanted to be closer to Emojingxian when she couldn't find him, so she flew here. But if Fengling was too difficult for her, Jinwan certainly didn't want to cause trouble for her. But she wanted to see Emojingxian as soon as possible. At least when she was sure he was safe, she could stand directly in front of him. What's the matter? All of a sudden, a cold voice rang not far behind Fengling. Hearing the voice, Jinwan immediately raised her eyes and looked at Nan Heng, who came in from the airport entrance. Chapter 282. Nan Heng moved his eyes away from Fengling's face and glanced at Jinwan. Jinwan had always known that Nan Heng's background was not simple. He was an arms dealer in the United States and had such a powerful 11 base behind him. The power he possessed was not something ordinary people could understand. It was truly unfathomable. But Nan Heng was usually good at talking. It was the first time that Jinwan saw him not wearing a shirt and trousers, but a black suit like Fengling's. This black suit was very uniform and seemed to be from 11 base. He was still cold and handsome, and because of this black suit, he looked cold and mysterious. What are you doing here? Nan Heng raised his eyebrows coldly. Emojingxian is here. Jinwan looked straight at him and said calmly. Nan Heng looked at her for a while, and then glanced at Fengling. It's not easy for me to get on the plane and follow you here under your nose. Fengling. He was obviously making fun of her, but Fengling's expression was cold, and she couldn't laugh. It seems that in terms of bravery, Jinwan is definitely not as good as you. But in terms of wisdom, I think Jinwan may be a little better than you. Jinwan. Fengling. The brothers who came with Nan Heng. In this world, only boss Nan Heng dared to belittle Fengling like this. After all, Fengling had been in the base for so many years and made so many achievements. How many raids and missions had been completed by Fengling's quick thinking and decisiveness? In terms of wisdom, Fengling had stayed in the base for so many years, but had never been found out that she was a woman. Wasn't boss Nan Heng, who had been in contact with her the most stupid one? Fengling coldly turned her head away from Nan Heng and said flatly, I'll have Kay send Mrs. Emo back. She's already here. How can we send her back? She landed in High City today, and we'll find a way to fly back tomorrow morning. At that time, I'm afraid Emojingxian will not be the only one missing. Nan Heng said coldly, she's trying to avoid our sight and stay in Cambodia, or standing in front of us safely. Which one is more worrisome? Fengling frowned. But it's too dangerous here. Before she flew here, she knew better than you that she would face many unknown dangers. She is not a child. She has made her own choices, and she has the ability to accept and bear them. What are you worried about? Nan Heng said and looked at Jinwan. We don't have much time. Go back to High City or stay here. I'll give you one last choice. I'll stay. Jinwan did not hesitate. Fengling frowned. But Mrs. Mo, you're pregnant. Hearing the word pregnant, Nan Heng abruptly glanced at Jinwan, and then at her stomach. Jinwan raised her hand and placed it on her flat abdomen, her tone gentle. I'll protect myself. But Nan Heng raised his hand to indicate for Fengling to shut up. He then glanced at the time and asked the other brothers and Fengling to leave first. Finally, he looked at Jinwan and asked solemnly, Jinwan, are you afraid of death? Jinwan looked into his eyes. No. Afraid of death? How could a person who had died be afraid of death? If it were anyone else, their eyes might flicker when they answered this word. But Jinwan's eyes were so firm that Nanheng couldn't help but narrow his eyes. Finally he snorted, picked up a cigarette, put it in his mouth, narrowed his eyes, and turned his head. Follow me. With that he turned and left. In such a place, no one would spare time to take care of Jinwan's physical condition and feelings. There were no rich young ladies or rich wives here. If she had the ability to keep up with everyone, she would follow. If she couldn't, she would go back to High City. Even if Nanheng didn't say this, Jinwan understood what he meant. She didn't say anything and quickly followed him. Nanheng and his men had been stationed near Tunnel Sap Lake in Cambodia for a day and a night. As the most mature member of the base, Feng Ling was bound to participate in this operation. So she suddenly left High City and flew straight to Cambodia. When Jinwan got out of the car, she saw the large warehouse and bulletproof sheds the base had temporarily rented here. Jinwan finally understood what Feng Ling meant when she said they were not in the same world. As a person living in a peaceful world, the most she heard about was 11 base related to Feng Ling. She knew something about arms trafficking, but she had never been involved in these things. However, at this moment, when Jinwan saw that almost all these people had a gun on their waist, and each of them looked serious and wore the same black uniform, Jinwan's heart suddenly jumped. The warehouse has been divided into some compartments. Let Feng Ling take you in to have a rest first. Nanheng simply said to Jinwan and left her alone. As the two of them walked in from time to time, some people looked at Jinwan up and down. Among these people, there seemed to be no woman except Feng Ling. And when they saw a woman appear, their eyes were obviously surprised. This is Mr. Mo's wife Jinwan. Feng Ling briefly introduced her as she passed by the people holding guns. In an instant, the people's eyes changed from surprise to respect. They nodded to her kindly and pointed inside. The third room inside is the cleanest. Jinwan found that these people seemed to have a special kind of respect for Mo Jingshan. What's the relationship between you and Mo Jingshan? Jinwan asked as she walked into the room where she was temporarily arranged. Since they had come here, Feng Ling knew that Jinwan would know it sooner or later. She pondered for a moment and then said in a low voice, "Needless to say, Nanheng's identity is the behind-the-scenes boss of the American underground arms business." Although Mr. Mo didn't participate in the underground arms business, he tried his best to save Nanheng and his secret arms channel and the lives of all the people in 11 base. To put it simply, Mr. Mo was the behind-the-scenes manipulator of the American underground arms business. He held the secrets behind these arms dealers, and he crushed the enemy again and again with his decisions and judgment that caught the enemy off guard. He was the most trusted and respected person by all of us, and also the person whom the enemy hated the most. That's why I said that day that Mr. Mo's head was worth 10 billion in the eyes of those people. Jinwan was confused. Why didn't I notice this? Because Mr. Mo didn't personally involve himself in the underworld. He only helped us in the past few years. He has always been a very pure Mo family member, and he really didn't need to involve himself in the underworld to open up his business. It's just that Mr. Mo's brain is too much for those people to hate. After all, any decision of Mr. Mo's can make those people lose billions overnight, and even face the danger of being besieged by the police, because a large part of the American police force has connections with Mr. Mo. So in this trip to Cambodia, someone must have specially set up a heavy ambush for Mr. Mo. Even the signal was blocked in such a timely manner. Clearly it was specially targeted. And it was precisely because the person they were targeting was Mr. Mo that they were so cautious. Chapter 283. When Feng Ling walked out of the warehouse, Nanheng was deploying a search and rescue plan outside. The moment the group of brothers saw Feng Ling, they all glanced at her. "What are you looking at? Haven't you seen a woman before?" Nanheng turned to glance at her because of their gazes, and then coldly stared at the others. "Everyone, I've never seen such a woman, Feng Ling." In fact, Feng Ling didn't change much. She still had short hair and was dressed in black, But now she didn't need to wear a corset and loose clothes to hide her figure. After staying by Jinwan's side for a long time, she didn't look as rough as she used to when she stayed in the base with a group of men all year round. Her skin looked much fairer than before, and even her eyes were not as cold and sharp as before. Nan Heng frowned coldly and glanced at Feng Ling indifferently. "What are you standing there for? Did I ask you to come here to be admired? Come back." Feng Ling calmly moved her eyes away from his face and expressionlessly walked into the crowd. Cambodia, formerly known as Khmer, was located on the Indochina Peninsula, bordering Thailand in the west and northwest, Laos in the northeast, Vietnam in the east and southeast, and the Gulf of Siam in the south. The mirror showed the Mekong River and Tunnel Sap Lake, the largest freshwater lake in Southeast Asia. The capital Phnom Penh. This was one of the least developed countries in the world. It was also one of the most difficult countries to control public security in the world. Cambodia should be cooler in December, but this year, the winter here was as hot as summer. In the dense forest near Tunnel Sap Lake, it was even more sultry. Mosquitoes, snakes, ants, and poisonous tropical insects often passed by because of the humidity. This was the second day Jinwan arrived in Cambodia. Most of the members of 11 Base brought by Nan Heng lived in a large warehouse cubicle outside the dense forest, and some of them were on duty in the bulletproof shed outside every day and night. There wasn't much food here, so they could only occasionally go to the barren village across the river to exchange money for rice and noodles. The dishes were all kinds of dried vegetables, dried meat, and dried fruits that they had brought before they came, which they cooked in boiling water and ate. After a day of searching, they had identified the location of the underground drug gang deep in the forest. Everyone was ready to go, waiting for Nan Heng's order to rush in and encircle those people. However, the only thing they could not confirm was whether Mo Jingshan was still in this area. Feng Ling explicitly forbade Jinwan from leaving their sight. Although Jinwan stayed in Cambodia as she wished, the only place she could move was between the warehouse and the bulletproof shed, and further away was an area guarded by their men on the edge of the jungle. "Mrs. Mo, you ate dried meat and fruits all day yesterday. Today, our people caught some fish and shrimps from outside. We plan to grill some freshwater seafood nearby. You should go and eat some fish. You need nutrition every day." When Feng Ling pushed the door open, she found that Jinwan had tidied up every compartment in the warehouse. Jinwan insisted on doing something. She didn't want to be the one who would only be a burden and needed to be protected, so Feng Ling agreed to let her clean up. However, she didn't expect that in just one morning, Jinwan had cleaned up all the 20 or 30 compartments. Even the socks that the brothers had taken off were gone. Feng Ling turned to see that there was a long line outside the back door of the warehouse. The pairs of socks had been washed and hung there. Why did you even wash the socks?" Feng Ling moved the corner of her mouth and looked at Jinwan's hands. "Did you wash them by hand?" "Of course. You came in such a hurry and didn't bring any daily necessities. Did you expect there to be a washing machine here?" Jinwan said as she swept the floor. The ground was covered with various tropical insects that had been killed by pesticides. Fortunately, they had brought a lot of pesticides. Otherwise, these insects from the jungle were likely to climb onto their beds. Jinwan was the daughter of the Ji family in High City. Whether before or after marrying Mo Jingshan, she should have never done these kinds of chores. Not only did she clean up the house and sweep the floor, but she also washed so many pairs of socks by hand. "Mrs. Mo, you don't have to do anything. Mr. Mo is the most respected and important person to us. You should enjoy preferential treatment here. You don't have to do these things. If I don't do something to keep myself busy, my heart will only be more chaotic. Are you worried about Mr. Mo?" Jinwan tightened her grip on the broom and looked up at her. "Although I'm worried, I believe in you and believe that he will be fine." Feng Ling smiled at her. "They won't be willing to take Mr. Mo's life. If Mr. Mo doesn't hand over the confidential information of the underground arms trade, they won't dare to touch him for the time being. We've confirmed his location, and just need to wait for the right time." Jinwan nodded. "I know. You can go ahead. You don't have to accompany me. I'll find something to do. Let's go eat the fish." They are already grilling it. Jin Wan thought for a while, swept the door, washed her hands, and went out with Feng Ling. The people in this base were indeed a group of young and strong men, who could be described as rough men. Most of them had been fighting in the wind and rain for a long time, so they were very simple and capable. Grilling fish was just grilling fish. They didn't put any oil, salt, or seasoning, and even if they did, they didn't know how much to use. No one knew how to cook, so these 2 days, they could only cook some rice and eat some jerky they brought with them. Jin Wan took a basin of fresh fish back to the warehouse. An hour later, the men in the base smelled the steamed fish, and all stuck their heads out to sniff in the direction of the warehouse. When Jin Wan took out the stewed fish and gave it to everyone in disposable bowls, the brothers all stared at Jin Wan in shock. "Mrs. Mo, did you make this?" "Yes, have a taste." Jin Wan smiled faintly and continued to take out bowls for everyone. When Feng Ling and Nan Heng heard the news and rushed over, they saw this scene. Jin Wan gave a bowl to each of the brothers and carefully soaked the hard-boiled rice and fish soup for everyone. Nan Heng took a bowl of soup from a man next to him, took a sip, raised his eyebrows and glanced at Jin Wan. Chapter 284. Jin Wan walked over. "I think everyone must have eaten well in America. These 2 days we've been too perfunctory. Since we can catch fish in the river, we can buy staple ingredients and seasonings from the village, together with the various jerky you brought. As long as we cook them properly, they can all become good meals." Jin Wan walked over. "So you stayed in Cambodia to cook for us?" Nan Heng looked at her with a faint smile. "Why can't I?" Jin Wan asked. Nan Heng raised his eyebrows. "Are you sure you can bear this grievance?" A man in the base next to him sipped fish soup and said, "Mrs. Emma washed all our socks this morning. There should be nothing more grievance than washing dozens of pairs of socks." Nan Heng's eyes were fixed on Jin Wan. "I think we'd better let Mo Jingshan run his own course." "Don't save him," he suddenly said indifferently. Jin Wan abruptly glanced at him. "What do you mean?" "If we save him and let him know that his wife is here to cook for us and wash our socks, I'm afraid the consequences won't be good." Jin Wan. She ignored him and turned back to the warehouse to continue scooping fish soup, saying as she walked, "When you went to buy staple food and dry food, you brought back too little salt, so the fish soup may still be a little bland. Remember to buy some oil, salt, and seasonings when you go to buy them today." With that, she went straight into the warehouse. Nan Heng stood still and turned to look at Feng Ling. Sure enough, there has never been a woman in the base. It's so rare to have a woman. It really feels different. Feng Ling was expressionless. "As long as you're not afraid of being poisoned to death, I don't mind cooking for you when we return to the base." Nan Heng glanced at her with a fake smile. "There is an American one-star chef in the base. Do you think we need you to show off your skills? But we do need a woman for this field operation." Feng Ling turned to leave, but her wrist was suddenly held. Her eyes turned cold, and she turned her head to look coldly at the big hand on her wrist. "Let go. Does it still hurt?" Nan Heng asked in a low and indifferent voice. Feng Ling's gaze instantly became even sharper. She was about to hit him away when the brother who was still slurping the soup by the side looked at the two of them in confusion and asked, "What? Does it still hurt?" Feng Ling was injured. It was probably not a small injury for our cold-faced boss to ask about it personally, right? "Aya, Feng Ling, where are you hurt?" Nan Heng raised his leg and kicked him in the shoulder. "Get lost. You're everywhere." The little brother was so frightened that he turned around and hid in the bulletproof shed with the bowl in his hands. He didn't know why boss was so angry. Only he was allowed to care about Feng Ling. But they couldn't? "I told you to let go of me." Feng Ling's expression turned cold. She struggled to break free from Nan Heng's grip. Nan Heng pinched her wrist effortlessly and looked at her from the side. "Behave yourself, huh? Get lost." Feng Ling was impatient and raised her leg to kick him. Jin Wan had just scooped out another bowl of fish soup when she heard strange noises from the jungle. The brothers who came to help her carry the bowl lowered their voices and said, "Mrs. Mo, don't go there. Boss and Feng Ling are fighting. Don't hurt you." Jin Wan. Jinwan began to think about the meals of these rough men in the base. In addition to the staple food she bought, and the fish and shrimp that could be fished out of the river, she also went to the edge of the jungle to look for edible vegetables. There were mushrooms everywhere, but no one was sure which ones were poisonous and which ones were not, so no one had come to pick them. Jinwan specially used her cell phone to check the classification of mushrooms and edible plants in this tropical jungle, and then carried a bamboo basket she bought from a family in the village into the jungle. For safety, Nanheng specially asked Feng Ling and Kay to accompany her in the jungle. "Mrs. Mo, is this kind of mushroom okay?" Kay was very tall and was said to be the best at close combat in their base. He was very upright and obedient, and he was very warm to Jinwan. Jinwan had just picked a small wild vegetable and put it into the bamboo basket. When she looked back and saw the mushroom in Kay's hand, the corner of her mouth twitched. "This is poisonous." Kay looked embarrassed, threw the mushroom away, and continued to follow her. Feng Ling beat back and forth in the grass with the bamboo pole, driving away all the insects and snakes that could get close to her, so that Jinwan could safely pick food here. At about 8 o'clock in the evening, the night was as dark as ink, and the stars hung in the sky. Everyone had a sumptuous dinner tonight, so some of the brothers ate too much and ran back and forth to the other side of the jungle to relieve themselves. Jinwan chatted with the brothers in the base for a while, and then got up to go out. Feng Ling walked with her along the river, talking along the way, but Feng Ling obviously avoided the topic about Nanheng. When the two of them came back to themselves, they were already hundreds of meters away from the base. The two of them were about to go back, when suddenly Feng Ling's eyes paused, and she turned her eyes in the direction of the narrow, dark river in the distance. Jinwan also turned her head, and saw a glimmer of light coming from the dark gap over there, flickering through the dense water grass. "Are they the fishermen in the village over there?" Jinwan asked in a low voice. Feng Ling's eyes were cold, but she took Jinwan's hand and took a step back, saying calmly as if nothing had happened, "I think so. Let's go back first." However, just as the two of them were about to leave in another direction, suddenly there was a faint voice not far away. It seemed that they were talking, speaking the local language of Cambodia, which Jinwan couldn't understand. When Feng Ling heard their conversation, she quickly pushed Jinwan behind the grass by the river and warned her in a low voice, "Squat here and don't come out." Weren't those people fishermen? At this time, two shadows jumped down from the opposite river, and Feng Ling had rushed over quickly. Jinwan was puzzled, and as Feng Ling said, she squatted down reflexively, hid behind the waist-high grass, and was about to pick up her cell phone to call Nanheng to inform him. However, holding the cell phone in her hand, she paused again. Although she was hiding in the grass and wouldn't be found, once her cell phone screen lit up, in such a dark place, she would definitely attract those people's attention. If she was found, Feng Ling would only be in the way to protect her. But now there were only the two of them here, and those people obviously came prepared. If Feng Ling dealt with them alone, she was afraid that something would happen. Chapter 285. A few minutes later, Feng Ling came back panting with blood on her face. She rushed into the grass where Jinwan was, but Jinwan was nowhere to be seen. "Mrs. Mo?" Feng Ling frowned. "Jinwan." Her low voice was scattered in the wind. The river of Tunnel Sap Lake in the distance was calm and dark. No one responded. Only a cell phone was left in the grass, lying there quietly. She was kidnapped. This was the first thought that came to Jinwan's mind when she woke up. And it turned out that she was indeed thrown on the ground. The room was so dark that she could barely see light. The air was damp, salty, and full of the smell of decay. She tried to move, but her wrists had been tied behind her back, and so were her legs. In just a few seconds, before Jinwan could react, there was a conversation outside the door, but she couldn't tell what they were talking about. Jinwan took a deep breath and forced herself to calm down. She rolled her eyes and looked around. It was a very common wooden house in Cambodia. It was very empty, and there was nothing in it. A kerosene lamp hung above his head, and the weak kerosene light was almost non-existent. There were moths clinging to the lampshade, casting a huge shadow on it. It looked very creepy and scary. Just as Jin Wan was wondering who had kidnapped her, the door was suddenly pushed open from the outside with a bang. Seeing the two wretched-looking, dark-skinned men, Jin Wan instinctively shifted back, pressing her back against the wooden wall. Her clear eyes stared at them warily. When she saw that they were holding a skinned, dead snake in their hands, she resisted the urge to vomit and gritted her teeth to prevent herself from making a sound in fear. Two people came in. One of them was carrying the snake, and the other was a short, fat man holding a gun of poor quality. He took a look at her, grinned, and turned to talk to the man holding the snake. They spoke in Cambodian, which Jin Wan couldn't understand, but seeing their smiles, Jin Wan pressed against the wall tightly. It would be a lie to say that she was not afraid. Finally, the short, fat man suddenly came over, squatted down in front of her, looked at her, and touched her face with his fat and dirty hand. Jin Wan didn't think and turned her head away. The pudgy man suddenly cursed in a low voice, still in a language that Jin Wan couldn't understand. He raised his hand and was about to slap her. Just a second before the slap fell, a stooped old woman of about 60 or 70 years old suddenly came in. The old woman coughed, and the two men immediately stood up and looked back at the old woman. Although they didn't look at her respectfully, they took a step back politely and didn't continue to say anything to Jin Wan, nor did they continue to be presumptuous. The old woman came in with a water ladle in her hand. She stared at Jin Wan for a while, walked over, got some water out of the ladle, and sprinkled it on Jin Wan's face. Under Jin Wan's confused look, she wiped her hand hard on her face until all the dust and dirt were washed off. Then she looked at her carefully for a while, and said to Jin Wan. It was still Cambodian. Jin Wan was worried that these people might be related to the recent incident. Once the fact that she was a Chinese was discovered, she might face more danger. She closed her mouth, pretended to be scared, and shook her head, meaning that she didn't understand. The old woman thought for a while and asked in broken Chinese, "Are you Chinese?" Jin Wan still shook her head blankly. Her mouth was not stuffed, so she could speak, but she still hummed, meaning that she was mute. The old woman thought she looked like a standard Asian beauty, but she couldn't tell which country she was from. After all, Asians mostly looked and had similar habits. After looking at her for a while, seeing that Jin Wan was still humming, she pointed to Jin Wan's mouth and asked her with her eyes if she could speak. Jin Wan hummed again and nodded hard. It turned out that she was mute. The old woman took another look at her, turned around, and said a few words to the two men in Cambodian. The two men reluctantly came over and pulled Jin Wan up. Jin Wan didn't understand, but seeing that they were helping her up and walking out with the old woman, she calmed down and let them help her out. When Jin Wan was taken out of the cabin, her eyes were suddenly covered with a black cloth. She couldn't see anything and could only be carried in an unknown direction. When they arrived, the two men put her down. Finally, the old woman came over and helped her untie the black cloth. Then she looked down at her for a while, pointed to the dense forest, and made an expression as if her hands would explode. She meant to tell Jin Wan that if she ran out casually, she would step on a minefield at any time and be blown up. Jin Wan immediately understood that this should be the center of the dense forest where Nan Hung and his men were going to encircle, and the area where the group of people were currently stationed. She had actually been brought here by accident. Could Emo Jingshan be here? Jin Wan controlled all her facial expressions and didn't show any flaws. She didn't look around, but kept her eyes on the old woman in front of her. The old woman untied the rope around Jin Wan's feet and took her to the largest cabin in the middle. When they got inside, they saw several middle-aged and young people in the cabin. When they saw the old woman bring Jin Wan in, they all stared at Jin Wan vigilantly and angrily scolded the old woman in Cambodian, as if complaining that the old woman brought strangers in. After talking to them for a while, the old woman pointed to Jin Wan's body, meaning that she was clean and had no dangerous things on her. Then she took Jin Wan's hand and sniffed it carefully. After saying something, the men stared at Jin Wan suspiciously. One of them was a middle-aged man in his 50s with gray hair, a square face, a lion's nose, and a scar running from his eyebrows to the left side of his face. He looked at Jinwan coldly and suddenly asked her in English, "Can you cook?" It turned out that the old woman smelled the seasoning on her hand and thought she was a cook. Jinwan still pretended that she didn't hear anything and just looked at the man with fear and confusion. The middle-aged man continued to stare at her coldly and asked in English, "Which country are you from? How did you get brought in by our men? There's no smell of guns or bullets on your hand, only the smell of food. Who on earth are you?" Jinwan looked helplessly at the old woman beside her and hid behind her in panic. At this time, there was a sudden noise outside the cabin, and an alarm sounded in the forest. Chapter 286. The middle-aged man with the scar coldly glanced at Jinwan, turned his head, and said a few words in Cambodian. Several people in the cabin suddenly rushed out and went outside to investigate the situation. A few minutes later, those people ran in. Obviously, not all of them were Cambodians. Most of them were gangsters from all over the world. When they came in, their words were mixed with Cambodian Khmer, and sometimes they were mixed with some English that was not particularly fluent. However, Jinwan could roughly tell that these people referred to the middle-aged man with the knife scar as Akib. Furthermore, their tone was very respectful. It seemed like this Akib was the boss of this group. Even if he wasn't the boss, he was definitely a senior figure. Finally, she had some idea of what was going on from the mixed English. The nearby fishermen went hunting in the woods and stepped on a minefield. They have been blown away, so the alarm was sounded. The people of 11 base outside the woods haven't moved yet. Akib's face darkened. Ignoring the man who had just come in to report, he turned his eyes to the two men who followed him in. "Was this woman caught by you?" The two men hurriedly answered respectfully, "Yes." Akib was displeased and frowned. "What happened?" The short fatty hurriedly said, "This woman was not with the people of 11 base, but she was sneaking around Tunnel Sap Lake. We suspected that there was something wrong with her, so we knocked her out and caught her. 11 base never allows women to enter. Did you find out why she came? Where did she come from?" The short fatty was embarrassed and hesitated for a long time before he said, "It seems that she is a tourist from a village near Tunnel Sap Lake. In the past 2 years, there have been a lot of tourists from all over Cambodia. This woman is white and clean, and she has nothing to do with 11 base. She may have been caught by us by mistake." Akib snorted coldly, bent over in a chair, took a look at Jinwan, frowned, and asked the old woman a few words in Cambodian. The old woman took Jinwan's hand and said a few more words to him. He was still suspicious about Jinwan's mute, but he still looked at her unkindly and suddenly gave a cold order. Suddenly, someone came over and dragged Jinwan away and took her out. The result of bringing him out was a body search. Those thick-armed, dark-skinned men dragged her into a tent and were about to tear off her clothes. She struggled desperately in fright. At this time, the old woman came in, glared at them, and said a few words, and they reluctantly left. The old woman came to search Jinwan in person. After she was searched from inside to outside, the old woman looked at her with satisfaction, helped her put on her clothes, and untied the rope in her hand. Jinwan's hands and feet were completely free, but she couldn't rush out of this place. Her intuition told her that the old woman seemed to think she was useful, so she protected her. Since he couldn't escape, he could only wait and see. As Jinwan expected, the old woman seemed to be an aunt brought by Akib. She had been taking care of Akib's gang for many years. She usually cooked, delivered water, and mended clothes for these people. Although her job was similar to that of a nanny, because she was old and careful enough, she was trusted by these people, so they respected this old woman. The old woman was in poor health and didn't have the strength to work. Seeing that Jinwan could cook, she asked Jinwan to cook and wash clothes with her. After Jinwan stayed here for one night, the old woman took her to Akib's place the next day. At that time, Jinwan had been forced by the old woman to change into a fluffy white dress that women in Cambodian farms often wore. And this dress had no pockets from top to bottom. She didn't know what the old woman was saying to Akib in Cambodian, but from the looks that Akib and his men suddenly cast at Jinwan, the old woman suggested that they keep Jinwan here to work and send someone to keep an eye on her at all times to make sure that she wouldn't do anything to threaten them. The old woman should have also mentioned that Jinwan was a beautiful woman who could cook, and they wouldn't suffer losses if they kept her here. The way those people looked at Jinwan made her more and more unbearable. Jinwan still lowered her head and didn't speak, as if she couldn't read their expressions or understand anything. She just held the food that she had just cooked with the old woman, put it on the table, and then lowered her head, clutching her white dress, as if she were very scared and nervous. She was so quiet, as if she didn't exist and wouldn't disturb them. Unlike his men who were staring at her with scorching eyes, Akib still looked at her coldly, and suddenly said in English, "Keep her alive for now. Let her work here. Dolly, follow her from now on. If she makes any suspicious movements, kill her." The young, strong, dark-skinned man named Dolly nodded. Akib could have said this in Cambodian, but he said it in English. It was obvious that he was talking to Jinwan. This man's suspicion hadn't been dispelled. It seemed that it wouldn't be easy for Jinwan to get out of here. Jinwan still lowered her head, as if she hadn't heard anything. After tasting the food cooked by Jinwan, Akib suddenly looked at her thoughtfully for a while, turned his head and said to his men in English, "Mr. Control hasn't eaten for 3 days, has he? Ask her to bring food to Mr. Control. It tastes good. Maybe he will eat it." Who was Mr. Control? Jinwan subconsciously felt that Akib, who could be described with the code name Control, couldn't be simple. The old woman obviously didn't expect that Akib, who was so distrustful of Jinwan, would ask Jinwan to bring food to that man. She asked in confusion. Akib glared at her and turned his head to order, "Dolly, take her to bring food to Mr. Control." Dolly nodded and signaled Jinwan to follow him out with his eyes. Jinwan didn't know why, but now she had to obey his orders to save her life. She went back to get the food she had prepared, carefully put it on the tray, and then followed Dolly all the way to a particularly hidden area behind the dense forest, until they came to a seemingly very sturdy cabin guarded on all sides. Dolly looked at her coldly, opened the door, and let her in. Jinwan walked in with the tray. The cabin was also a little damp and musty, but as soon as she stepped in, she suddenly smelled the familiar scent of grass and trees. Chapter 287. She froze in an instant, raised her eyes subconsciously, and looked into the cabin. There was a man standing in the cabin, with his back to the door and his face to the window, which was nailed with dozens of thin steel bars. Through the gap of the steel bars, he stood there silently, looking out of the window. A pair of black Italian handmade leather shoes came into her sight. Compared with the careful care they used to have, the shoes now looked a little old, stained with mud and a little dark red blood. His leg was as straight and slender as ever, wrapped in black trousers. His black handmade shirt was a little wrinkled, which seemed to hide some blood, but it was almost invisible because of the color of the shirt. But even in such a situation, the man just stood there quietly, still clean, handsome, noble and indifferent, and absolutely lofty. Such a lofty air was not as unreachable as when he was in a high position in the business world. Instead, he was like a wisp of pure air that could not be contaminated by mud. No matter what evil and filth entangled him, he could still wash away the filth and be invulnerable. He was standing there, and he was still him. Emo Jingshan, he was really here. Jinwan's mouth moved subconsciously, but because the man named Dolly was behind her, only about a meter away from her, he would immediately notice any unusual attitude or action she made now. If that happened, not only would she die, but Emo Jingshan, who was safe and sound for the time being, would also be implicated. She silently put the tray and food in her hand on the table in front of the door. Seeing the man in front of the window standing there coldly without looking back, she secretly gritted her teeth and didn't make a sound. Dolly stood right behind her, watching her every move. Seeing her put down the dishes, Dolly suddenly said in English, "Mr. Control, we caught a woman, and her cooking is more in line with your Chinese taste. You haven't had a drop of water, or a bite of food for 3 days and 3 nights. Please don't fight with us like this, Mr. Control. If you die, the secrets of the arms trade may not be kept. The man in front of the window didn't look back as if he didn't hear him. It turned out that Mo Jingshan was the one they called Control. Seeing that Mo Jingshan didn't respond, Dolly was not in a hurry. He sneered and said in English, "Mr. Control, I don't know whether the woman we just caught is from China, Japan, or other Asian countries. She is very beautiful. Akib's plan is to let her work here first, and when the operation is over, we will give her to our brothers to enjoy. If Mr. Control likes, Akib may let you touch her first. This woman is still clean." Jinwan kept her head lowered. When she heard his words, she clenched the empty tray in her hand and stared at the food on the table. Had he not eaten or drunk anything for 3 days and 3 nights? How did he get through it? But unfortunately, this woman is mute, Dolly added. The man in front of the window was obviously annoyed by Dolly's noise and turned his head. The moment Mo Jingshan turned around, Jinwan's heart jumped to her throat. The man in front of the window also raised his eyelids when he saw her. His indifferent eyes swept over her and finally fell on the white dress she was wearing. His eyes were extremely calm, as if he were looking at something unimportant, as if he had never seen it before. His handsome face was calm, but there was a moment of deepness in his eyes, as if there was a veil of coldness in them. However, this emotion only flashed by, and no one caught it. Even Jinwan's heart tightened under his cold gaze. If she hadn't been sure that he was indeed Mo Jingshan, she would have suspected that he was someone who looked exactly like him, someone who didn't know her at all. She just glanced at him quickly and looked away. When Mo Jingshan looked at her, his eyes were judgmental, unscrupulous, and even cold. "Get out," he said in a clear voice. It was a sentence in English that was easy to understand. Jinwan shivered all over and felt that all the hair on her body was about to stand on end. Dolly narrowed his eyes, looked at Jinwan, who had been silent, and then looked at Mo Jingshan, who seemed to be very strange to this woman he had just caught, and was as cold and distant as ever. Dolly finally dispelled his suspicion of Jinwan. "Mr. Control, why do you want to kill yourself? Ordinary people would have been lying in bed without any strength after 3 days of hunger. But Mr. Control, you can fight us to the end without eating, drinking, or sleeping. But no matter what, you are immortal. How long can you last? 1 day? 2 days? Or 10 days? Dolly said with a sneer. Mo Jingshan was indifferent. Dolly smiled coldly again and pointed to the food on the table with his eyes. "Are you sure you don't want to eat? The food this woman cooks is really delicious." Mo Jingshan was expressionless. He glanced at the food on the table in the corner and said coldly, "Did she cook it?" Hearing the hidden meaning in his words, Dolly immediately looked warily at him and Jinwan, who had been standing there quietly. Mo Jingshan came over, stopped by the table, raised his eyelids and looked at Jinwan again. "Where are you from?" Jinwan pursed her lips and said nothing. Dolly chuckled. "I told you she is a mute. Her skin is so white. I guess she is either from China or Japan or Korea." Mo Jingshan gave an ambiguous smile. "Mute? What? Mr. Control, you don't believe me?" Dolly suddenly reached out and pinched Jinwan's arm hard. Jinwan bit her lip in pain but didn't make a sound. She turned her eyes away with a pale face and didn't look at Mo Jingshan's expression. She was afraid that if her eyes met his, she would be exposed. Dolly pinched her while watching Mo Jingshan's face. Mo Jingshan didn't even look at Jinwan. He said, "Akib knows me better and better. He knows that I don't like you good-for-nothings, so he sent me a mute." Dolly immediately glanced at him. Mo Jingshan said coldly, "Unfortunately, I'm not interested." Dolly froze and moved his hand away from Jinwan's arm. Before he spoke, Mo Jingshan raised his hand slightly and mercilessly knocked over the food on the table. The food and soup spilled all over the floor. He didn't even look at them and turned around coldly. Obviously, he was extremely tired of them. Chapter 288. As soon as the door of the cabin was closed, Jinwan's heart sank to the bottom, but at the same time, hope rose. Mo Jingshan was still alive. A moment ago, he was standing in front of her. Although Mo Jingshan's attitude was unbelievably cold, Jinwan more or less knew his keenness and decisiveness. If he had shown any trace of a relationship with her just now, she would have been killed by Dolly's gun in an instant. But now that she finally found him, she couldn't even say a word to him, and had to suffer his indifference. Even the food was knocked over. Jinwan felt a little depressed, but more because she heard that he hadn't eaten anything for 3 days and 3 nights. Dolly walked out with a cold face. Obviously, he was annoyed by Mo Jingshan's attitude. He turned back and urged Jinwan to go faster, his tone very unkind. Jinwan followed him quietly, getting farther and farther away from the cabin where Mo Jingshan was. And she didn't look back. Mo Jingshan's attitude was very obvious. Here, whether it was him or her, any carelessness could lead to serious consequences, or even death on the spot. He was already careful, so she should be more cautious. No matter whether she could save him or not, she should at least not hold him back. Jinwan certainly didn't know that since she left the cabin, there were more than a dozen guns pointed at her in the dense forest around her. Once she looked back or looked at the cabin, she would be shot to death. The old woman was still waiting in Akib's cabin. Hearing the noise outside and seeing that Jinwan had come back safe and sound, she immediately said a few words in Cambodian to Akib, who had been expressionless, with a happy look on her face. Akib obviously didn't expect that Jinwan was really not sent to rescue Mo Jingshan. Although he still looked at Jinwan with cold and sharp eyes, he no longer paid attention to her. He waved his hand and motioned the old woman to take her out first. Jinwan followed the old woman out and glimpsed some small white flowers around. These flowers were not common in China, and she could still smell their strong fragrance from a long distance. If she remembered correctly, this should be the national flower of Cambodia, Lunda flower. Seeing that Jinwan had been looking at these flowers and seemed to be interested in them, the old woman took her over with a smile, bent over, picked a few flowers, and handed them to her. Jinwan looked at the old woman in surprise, pointed to the flowers, and then pointed to herself, meaning that she could take these flowers? The old woman nodded and was about to speak, but remembering that she didn't understand, she just smiled, put the flowers in her hand, and took Jinwan back to the cooking tent. Although this old woman was respected by the people here, she was actually a servant who was responsible for washing and cooking. She lived in a very simple and damp cabin next to the cooking tent, and then she asked Jinwan to live with her. Because she had seen Mo Jingshan today, Jinwan was a little relieved, so she behaved more prudently and listened to the old woman's arrangements. After entering the tent, the old woman found a white dress for her to change into, and then gave her a very thin quilt. It could be seen that this old woman had no companion all year round. It was not easy to meet a young girl in a place full of wild men. She really hoped that Jinwan wouldn't be killed by these people, and hoped that Jinwan could stay and help her cook. In the evening, Jinwan and the old woman were busy preparing dinner and sending it to Akib's room. Every time Akib saw Jinwan, he would stare at her for a while. Jinwan kept her head down. If she was too calm, it would only arouse suspicion, so her hands holding the bowl were trembling faintly. She looked helpless and pitiful, as if she was very afraid of everyone here. The short fat man, who had caught Jinwan, was also in this room. Seeing her come in, he suddenly smiled and turned to Akib and murmured something in Cambodian. Akib ignored him, but a man next to him suddenly said in English, "This woman's skin is really white, which is rare in Asia. It's like the snow I saw on the snowy mountains. Her face is also very small, and her eyes are big and bright like stars. She has a good figure, slender waist and plump buttocks. She's so sexy." Then the people in the room suddenly began to speak in English. Some of them were very proficient in English, and some spoke poorly, but at least Jinwan could understand them. They were all infuriating erotic words that were extremely unpleasant to the ears. They could have spoken Cambodian, but they chose to speak English. It was clear that they were still testing her. Jinwan had been standing beside the old woman with her neck shrunk, as if she hadn't heard anything, and still looked scared and timid. Then suddenly someone next to Akib said, "There are a lot of farms near Tunnel Sap Lake, and there are many women, but it's really hard to find such a white and tender woman." We haven't had a good time in a long time, because of Mr. Control. If this woman serves us well for a few days, when the operation is over, we can just throw her on the bed to satisfy our cravings." The room instantly roared with laughter. The men's gazes on Jin Wan became even more unkind. They could no longer be described as simply wretched. Jin Wan's heart chilled and she felt disgusted, but she still hid behind the old woman timidly. Then these people saw that she really didn't seem to hear them, so they switched back to Cambodian. After dinner, Akib suddenly said in English while wiping his mouth, "Dolly, ask this woman to continue to send food to Control. Tell him that if he refuses to eat, it means that the food this woman cooks is not to his taste. She is a waste, and it's useless to keep her alive. If he doesn't eat, we'll kill her." Jin Wan felt a chill on her back. Hadn't Akib finished testing her? No matter whether Mo Jingshan ate the food she sent or not, she would face a dead end. Now even if she resisted by committing suicide, she would still face a dead end, and she might even implicate him. Dolly quickly agreed, grinned and said, "Okay, I'll ask her to go right away." With that, he came over, stood in front of Jin Wan, and glanced at her coldly. Without speaking, he just signaled her to go out with him with his eyes. Chapter 289. Seeing her like this, Dolly muttered something that Jin Wan couldn't understand. She guessed that he must have said something like trouble, or something like that. Jin Wan went to the cooking tent. Outside, Dolly kicked over the kettle set up outside the tent, telling her with his eyes to hurry up. He was very impatient now. Jin Wan nodded at him. Most of the people here were ferocious. She had to be careful with every step she took, and not offend them easily. Dolly looked at her coldly from outside the tent. Jin Wan shrank inside, holding a small bowl, filled herself with soup with trembling hands, and then carefully took a sip. Seeing that she was really hungry, Dolly stopped looking at her and let her drink, but he still urged her in an impatient tone. Jin Wan pretended not to hear him, and glanced out from time to time as she drank the soup. When Dolly went to the cabin next door to grab a cigarette from another man's hand to smoke, Jin Wan quickly stirred the pot with her hands. Looking at the bubbling soup in the pot, she suddenly made up her mind and knocked over the pot with her hands. In an instant, the hot soup splashed out and drenched the backs of her hands and wrists. She screamed in pain, fell back and plopped to the ground. Hearing the noise, Dolly rushed back in an instant, lifted the curtain of the tent and looked in, only to see that the pot on the fire had been knocked over and spilled all over the ground. Jin Wan sat on the ground, trembling in pain, and the back of her hand was instantly scalded with blisters. The blisters were so red that it was unbearable to look at. Dolly immediately cursed outside, walked in, grabbed Jin Wan by the collar, and pulled her up without mercy. Jin Wan was almost dragged out of the tent by him. When he came out, he was about to kick her when the old woman happened to come back at this time. She shouted and hurried over to rescue Jin Wan from his hands. She looked at Jin Wan's hands with distress, and asked her a lot of questions, as if she was caring for her and blaming her. Jin Wan really didn't understand this time. She could only try to make herself look particularly pitiful, innocent and scared. She looked at the old woman with red eyes full of tears, scared and aggrieved, raised her blistered hands, pointed to her stomach and mouth, and then to the bowl on the ground in the tent. The old woman knew that she hadn't eaten much since she was caught yesterday. Seeing that Jin Wan's hands were so scalded, it was difficult for her to move, let alone deliver food. After the old woman said a few words to Dolly, he looked at Jin Wan coldly with displeasure, obviously not intending to let her go. Akib asked her to deliver food to Control, but in the blink of an eye, her hands were scalded like this. Whether it was a coincidence or she did it on purpose, this woman couldn't be left alive now. The old woman had been defending Jin Wan, so Dolly turned around with a cold face, went back to the cabin where Akib was, and reported the situation. The old woman helped Jin Wan up, and kept speaking Cambodian. It seemed that she was distressed about Jin Wan's hands, and asked her what was going on. Jin Wan didn't make any sound, but followed her into the shabby cabin next to her with her head down. Now the back of Jin Wan's hands hurt badly when they were touched, and the scalded places felt like they were on fire. The old woman came over with a needle, pressed her hands forcibly, and pricked them one by one. Jinwan trembled all over with pain, but she bit her lips hard. This time, her eyes were not red because she pretended to be afraid and wronged, but because of the pain, and tears welled up in her eyes. She had never suffered such heart-wrenching pain in her 2 lives, and her lips were bleeding from biting. Afterward, the old woman brought over some kind of medicine, which seemed to be a plant powder exclusive to Southeast Asian countries. It was gray and white, and she sprinkled it on the back of her hand. Then she cut off a strip from the bottom of Jinwan's white dress, wrapped it around the back of her hand and wrist, and patted her hand, indicating that she should rest tonight and not go to work. Jinwan nodded gratefully to the old woman. Out of the instinct of an innocent person who was caught, Jinwan pointed to the outside of the jungle and looked at the old woman eagerly, meaning that she wanted to know when she could leave here. The old woman looked at her sympathetically, but shook her head. There were only 2 ways to go after being caught and brought to such a place. Either she had to take care of these people all year round like she did, or she had to die. There was no way she would be let go. It didn't take long for the old woman to leave the room. Jinwan sat inside and waited until the old woman was far away, before she got up and moved her wrist with some difficulty. The pain made her more aware of the situation she was facing now. She stood in front of the window and looked out. This was a camp made up of many wooden huts, grass huts and tents. It was in the deepest part of the forest and was surrounded by greenery. It was not a small area, and her vision was blurry in the dark. She could not see the specific appearance of the huts, only their outlines. There was a fire in the middle of the clearing, and a circle of people surrounded it. They were holding wine and meat, eating, drinking, and laughing loudly. From time to time, they would cast sharp glances in her direction. It was as if the matter of throwing her onto the bed, to have a good taste of her in a keep's hut, had been officially put on their agenda. Jinwan's heart grew colder and colder when she saw the guns on their waists. This was not a peaceful country at all. There would never be such a place in China, but this was Cambodia. In the next few years, many international rescues were related to the civil strife in Cambodia. Whether it was the Mekong River or the Tunnel Sap Lake, there had been countless accidents. 10 years ago, the security here was even worse than 10 years later, and the peacekeeping situation here was not as good as it would be 10 years later. If she wanted to leave, she could only save herself. Outside the dense forest, Feng Ling changed into a tight-fitting black outfit, with 2 silencer guns on her waist. She was squatting down to tie her shoelaces, and at the same time, she put the dagger shining with cold light into the sheath next to her boots. "What are you doing?" Just as she was about to tie her shoelaces and get up, suddenly, a dark shadow appeared in front of her, and a pair of black leather boots stopped in front of her. She didn't need to look to know it was Nan Heng's voice. Feng Ling didn't look up. She fixed the dagger by her boots, touched the gun at her waist, stood up, and looked expressionlessly at the cold man in front of her. "Jinwan has been taken away for a day and a night. I have to go in to find her." Chapter 290. Feng Ling's eyes were cold. "She was caught when she was with me. Whether from Mr. Mo's point of view, or from the point of view of me as her bodyguard, the responsibility is on me. Even if I'm smashed to pieces, I must bring her back safely. I'm afraid that you won't be able to find her even if you're blown up," Nan Heng scolded. "Mr. Mo has the secrets of the arms dealers. Those people have been afraid of the pressure Mr. Mo exerted on them, so they don't dare to do anything to him. But Jinwan is different. She doesn't know those people, and doesn't know how bloodthirsty they are. It's normal for them to kill people without blinking, not to mention that she is pregnant. It's because she is pregnant. With Jinwan's IQ, she should be able to see the pros and cons of this place. If she has a child, she will better protect herself. If you rush in now, you'll just be hitting a stone with an egg," Nan Heng said coldly. "I know you are more anxious than anyone else because of Jinwan's accident. You two have developed a very good relationship after getting along with each other for so long. But Feng Ling, remember, you are a member of 11 Combat Base. Have you forgotten the rules of the base? Feng Ling looked at him coldly and said nothing. Don't be impulsive. That's the first rule. Nan Heng abruptly kicked her calf. When Feng Ling was about to dodge, he reached out and snatched the two guns from her waist. He spun them in his hand, and then put the guns into his own waist. You! Feng Ling glared at him. Just stay here and wait. If it weren't for the minefield in this jungle, I would have gone in long ago. Why are you so anxious here? Nan Heng said expressionlessly. I've informed the Domestic Border Rescue Team and the SWAT team in the United States, who used to be on good terms with Mo Jingshan. They'll be here soon with a helicopter. Just wait patiently, Ann. We also have helicopters. I can drive him myself. Feng Ling frowned. Bullshit. Nan Heng directly scolded her. How many years has it been since the people inside fought against our base? Why haven't they been wiped out? Now that they have the ability to ambush Mo Jingshan, it is enough to show that they have set up layers of ambushes here, just waiting for the people from our base to enter. If you fly in now, before you can land on the airdrop to rescue him, you will be shot down by the people below. After so many missions, you have always been the calmest and most cautious. This time you can't calm down? Feng Ling pursed her lips and frowned. If you can't calm down, go back to High City and wait for news. You're not needed here. Nan Heng scolded coldly again. After confiscating her gun, he ignored her and turned to leave. Looking at his cold and tall back, Feng Ling suddenly took a step forward and reached out to snatch the gun back. But Nan Heng pressed her hand on his shoulder and threw her up. Feng Ling kept attacking him fiercely, but Nan Heng just looked at her coldly and expressionlessly, raised his hand to block, and only defended. In the end, he clasped her wrist and suddenly pulled the short-haired woman into his arms. Seeing this, Feng Ling immediately began to struggle in his arms, and Nan Heng lowered his head and bit her hard on the neck. You're the one who's going to die. Let me go. Feng Ling trembled in pain and shouted hoarsely. Hearing the noise here, Kay and the brothers in the base came over to see if there was anything wrong, but they immediately saw this scene. Shit. The two brothers decisively covered their eyes with their hands, and then peeped out a little. The corner of Kay's mouth also twitched. What was going on? What was going on with Boss and Feng Ling? Seeing someone coming over, Feng Ling suddenly stepped on Nan Heng's foot fiercely, bent her leg back, and kicked at his leg bone. Nan Heng released her in time, and dodged her attack with his leg. Feng Ling raised her hand and rubbed it hard on her neck, glanced at him coldly, and then turned to look at Kay and the others, saying coldly, What are you looking at? Kay coughed, saw the bite mark on Feng Ling's neck, and was about to leave with the other two brothers, when Feng Ling suddenly said because they seemed to understand something. Just now a snake came over and I was bitten. Boss just came to help me suck the poison out, so it's not what you saw. It would have been better if she hadn't explained, but as soon as she did, Kay and the others immediately fled faster. Damn, with Feng Ling's ability, let alone being bitten by a snake, even if she was bitten, how could a snake have climbed to her neck without being discovered? And it could even bite her neck. What kind of snake could do that? Seeing them running fast, Feng Ling turned to look at Nan Heng with a livid face, but Nan Heng put one hand in his black trouser pocket, and the other hand played with the silencer he had taken from her, raising his eyebrows at her very unkindly. Feng Ling closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and suddenly reached out. Give me back the gun. Nan Heng sneered. Speaking of being bitten by a snake, when you were on a mission in the United States, you were really bitten by a poisonous snake in the jungle. Do you still remember how I sucked the poison out for you? Feng Ling kept a straight face and said nothing. If it hadn't been for that incident, he wouldn't have found out that she was a woman. She gave up the gun in his hand, turned to leave, and then pulled out the dagger at her feet, threw it behind her fiercely, deeply stabbed it into the ground, and walked away quickly with no expression on her face. Nan Heng glanced at the dagger accurately inserted into the ground at his feet, snorted, picked up the dagger, and followed her. Jinwan didn't sleep well, and was startled in her sleep. She turned over, and felt an inexplicable chill on her back. She opened her eyes with a jerk, only to see a black muzzle pointed at her head. Jinwan didn't know what was going on. She didn't know what was going on. She was startled, and at the same time, her face immediately changed into a more obvious panic, and she hurriedly sat up. The muzzle had been pointed at her. She shrank in the corner of the wooden bed, hugged her legs tightly, and looked up at the owner of the gun who was holding it. Akib's finger pulled the trigger, looked at her coldly, and asked in English, "Tell me, who on earth sent you to lurk here? Do you think you can escape by deliberately spilling the soup? Ha, what a joke, thinking that you're smart." With that, the cold muzzle was directly pressed against her forehead. As long as his thumb gently pressed, Jinwan's head would be pierced by the bullet in an instant. Chapter 291. Akib was about to pull the trigger, but Jinwan saw that there was no one else in the cabin, not even the old woman who had been protecting her. She thought she might really die this time, but fortunately, she didn't implicate Emo Jingshan. She felt a chill in her heart and slowly closed her eyes, but the sweat overflowing from her nose clearly showed her fear and nervousness, which was not the instinctive reaction of a well-trained informant or base personnel. Akib glanced at her hesitantly again, but he still couldn't let this kind of person live. He was about to kill her, when suddenly, Dolly ran in from outside. Dolly didn't know what he said, but it sounded like he was in a hurry. Akib paused, withdrew his eyes from Dolly, looked at Jinwan coldly, and said in English, "Control is our distinguished guest. He hasn't eaten or drunk anything for 4 days. No matter how strong his mind and body are, he can't hold on. Now he has collapsed and will die at any time." Jinwan still looked at him blankly, as if she couldn't hear anything. Seeing that she was still scared out of her wits, Akib suddenly put away the gun impatiently, turned back, said a few words to Dolly in Cambodian, and left. Jinwan's heart was beating like a drum. She didn't expect that she would escape death. And the reason why she escaped death was that Emo Jingshan hadn't eaten or drunk anything for 4 days. He had fallen down to distract Akib's attention from her. Akib said that Emo Jingshan had collapsed. What did that mean? Did he faint or did something happen to him? Jinwan didn't dare to show her worry on her face. She just looked at Dolly standing in the room with fear. Dolly signaled her with his eyes to get out of bed and follow him. Jinwan bit her lower lip and pointed to her hand, which was still wrapped in gauze, meaning that she could no longer deliver food or do anything in her current state. Dolly impatiently kicked the wooden bed under her. Knowing that she was mute and couldn't hear anything, he muttered a few curses and impatiently urged her to go with him. Jinwan could only get off the bed with a timid expression. She shrunk her neck and followed behind him, as though she was afraid of death. Dolly took her to the surrounded cabin where Emo Jingshan was. Jinwan was a little worried that they would continue to carry out the order Akib had given her last night. She was thinking about how to avoid this deadlock. Suddenly, Akib signaled her with his eyes to go to the stone table over there and put the bowl of water in. Jinwan looked at him in confusion. Akib pointed at the water, and then at the cabin where Emo Jingshan lived. His meaning was obvious. He wanted her to go in and deliver the water. Not delivering food, but water instead? What does that mean? The door of the cabin was open. She remembered that Emo Jingshan's body did not show any signs of being tied up. But he did not come out. Could he have really fainted? Jinwan slowly moved to the door of the cabin and looked in. She saw Emo Jingshan, who had always been tall and straight, sitting against the wooden wall by the window of the cabin. His eyes were closed, his face was pale, and his lips were a little cracked and white. Obviously, he was seriously dehydrated and was in a semi-coma. He did not lie down but insisted on sitting there, closing his eyes to rest. It turned out that their purpose was to let her go in and feed him water. Jinwan glanced at him, and then turned her eyes to the bowl of water on the rough stone table outside. She walked over and under Dolly's cold stare, picked up the bowl of water. She didn't know if Emo Jingshan had been refusing to eat their food and water because he was worried that they would poison him, or if he was just resisting. But now she was even more uncertain whether there was poison in the bowl of water. As Jinwan walked to the cabin with the bowl in her hands, she suddenly spilled some of the water in the bowl on the back of her hand that had been scalded last night. It hurt so much that she dropped the bowl, and the whole bowl of water spilled out in an instant. Seeing her clumsy appearance, Dolly was about to kick her, and even wanted to take out a gun and shoot her. But he remembered that Akib had told him that Control had completely refused everyone here. But this woman was not one of them. Moreover, women were more careful than men like them. Now she was asked to take care of Control, find a way to feed him water, make him eat, and keep him alive. That was the right thing to do. Otherwise, if Control really died like this, they would lose the trump card in their hands that could threaten 11 Base and the American police, let alone the fact that they hadn't got those secrets yet. He had to be kept alive. Dolly suppressed his temper, cursed, and asked Jinwan to fetch another bowl of water. Jinwan got up shakily, nodded at him, and then trotted to the man-made well near the cooking tent, got a bowl of clean water, and carefully brought it over. Dolly glared at her, warned her not to dawdle, and told her to go in and feed him the water. But after she went in, Dolly and several people guarded the door and the window, staring at the situation inside, and watching Jinwan and Mo Jingshan's expressions. They would not miss any suspicious clues. Jinwan walked in, and quickly came up to Mo Jingshan. She tried to make her raised hand tremble a little, but her trembling would not be regarded as excitement or nervousness. They would only think that she was afraid. She carefully brought the water to Mo Jingshan's slightly parched lips. Even though the man had not eaten, drank, washed, or slept for 4 days and his breathing was much thinner than usual, when his breath brushed against her hand, it was still warm, clear, and uniquely Mo Jingshan's scent. Jinwan raised the bowl and tried to feed him the water, but the man's lips were closed. Although he didn't close them tightly, she couldn't feed him. She couldn't speak, so she could only pat him gently on the shoulder with her hand. Mo Jingshan frowned, and didn't open his eyes. Feeling the bowl of water near his mouth, he turned his head away. Jinwan was really anxious this time. She pressed the bowl hard against his mouth and patted him on the shoulder. But it was useless, so she had to raise her hand and pat him on the face. If it were any other time, Mo Jingshan would definitely smell the familiar scent on her body. He would definitely know who she was. But after 4 or 5 consecutive days of suffering, even if his sense of smell hadn't failed, he would not be so sensitive in his current state of dehydration and weakness. Seeing that he still didn't open his eyes or mouth, Jinwan simply pressed his outstretched leg down and sat on his knee. Chapter 292. The moment their eyes met, Jinwan stared at him, and then pointed to the water in the bowl with her finger. All of Mo Jingshan's senses seemed to slowly recover at this moment. He smelled a long-lost fragrance coming from Jinwan's body. It was similar to the cold fragrance after taking a shower in the morning. It was fresh and sweet, with the calming smell of dawn in High City, and the unique fragrance of long dew flowers in this place. The people outside the room were staring at their expressions. Jinwan didn't speak, but signaled him to drink the water quickly with her eyes. Mo Jingshan didn't move, nor did he take the bowl of water. His cold gaze made her shudder. Even though Jinwan knew that it was impossible for him to show any intimacy or friendliness to her at this time, she was still frozen by his eyes. Just as she was about to force the water into his mouth, the man slowly closed his eyes once more, using the method of isolating himself from her gaze and refusing to meet her eyes again. Jinwan was anxious again. She sat on his lap and patted him hard on the shoulder with her other hand. Damn it, why couldn't she pretend to be a mute? Now she couldn't speak. She was so anxious. The man didn't even move his eyebrows. He just sat there silently, saying nothing and not opening his eyes. He seemed to treat the people here the same way he treated them, still so distant. Jinwan's hand was scalded, so she couldn't pinch him hard. She could only keep patting his shoulder in vain until the man frowned, because of her constant harassment. When he opened his eyes again, Jinwan raised her scalded hand and waved it in front of his eyes. Mo Jingshan, you fool, I'm trapped here with you. I've tortured myself like this, but I'm still trying to survive. Your life is so important. You can't die. Jinwan couldn't speak and could only look at him, glaring at him. Mo Jingshan saw the white cloth wrapped around her hand, and the burn marks on the unbandaged area outside the white cloth. The punctured blisters were infected by the ash of those useless herbs. After one night, they had become red and swollen, and a thin layer of skin had been festered. It could be seen that they were seriously scalded. Mo Jingshan's gaze slowly moved away from her hand. Jinwan stared at him with reddened eyes. Her gaze gradually turned pleading as she begged him to drink some water. However, the man only looked at her like this for a moment before closing his eyes again. His attitude was still as cold as ever. Seeing that she hadn't even fed him a mouthful of water, Dolly stood in front of the door and looked at her sharply, reaching for the gun at his waist. There was no need to keep such a good-for-nothing. Out of the corner of her eye, Jinwan saw Dolly touch the gun, and her heart beat wildly. Looking at Mo Jingshan's pale lips, she suddenly raised the bowl, drank a mouthful of water, leaned down, and threw herself on him. Before the man could react, she pressed her lips against his closed lips and poured all the water into his mouth. The man frowned at her sudden movement and opened his eyes abruptly. His deep dark eyes met hers, which were still bright even though they were close at hand. Jinwan stuck out her tongue, opened his teeth, and licked his mouth in a way that Dolly and the people in front of the window couldn't see, as if she were licking him or deliberately punishing him. He instantly darkened his eyes and stared at her. Jinwan quickly stepped back, looking as if she had no choice but to feed him in this way to survive. She lowered her head, took another mouthful of water, and threw herself on him again, pouring water into his mouth. This time, the man didn't force his mouth to close. When her tongue seemed to unconsciously reach in, the man felt the softness of her lips and quietly sucked it. Jinwan shuddered and stared at him. They both knew each other's meaning. Even though Jinwan understood why he had been so cold, at this moment, she still felt a sour feeling in her heart. If she continued to feed him with her mouth, it would be too deliberate. She was thinking about what to do when suddenly, the man's deep eyes turned cold. When Dolly came in and was about to take a closer look, he pushed Jinwan mercilessly and pushed her out of his arms with great force. Jinwan was caught off guard and suddenly fell back to the ground. Jinwan reacted quickly. She immediately looked in horror at Dolly, who was approaching with cold eyes. She hurriedly picked up the bowl that had been spilled on the ground, stood up in a panic, and silently pointed to the water stain on the corner of Mo Jingshan's mouth, indicating that she had completed her task and begged Dolly not to kill her. Dolly gave her a cold look and tilted his head, indicating for her to go out. Jinwan nodded quickly, turned around and ran out. Dolly didn't miss any expression on her face. It was not until she went out that he turned his eyes back to Mo Jingshan. "Mr. Control, you are really a man of extraordinary perseverance. But as long as we don't want you to die, you won't die. When you really pass out, we'll put something into your mouth even if we have to, just like that mute woman just now. I think you enjoy it very much. Why don't you let her feed you in this way for the next meal?" Mo Jingshan coldly curved his lips. The water stain on his lips had dried. His lips were still a little cracked and pale, but he didn't lose his cool demeanor. He indifferently looked at Dolly's smug eyes. "I'll be disgusted to death by you before I starve to death." The man spat out a cold and even disgusted English sentence. Dolly raised his eyebrows. Disgusted? Although the woman just now was mute, she was good-looking. How was she disgusted? Our people are all ready to make a meal of her in a few days. Don't you like Asian beauties? Looks like we should catch some Western beauties to please you. For the next 2 days, you should feel wronged. Let this Asian woman bring you food. That's right. Mo Jingshan's eyes became colder. You can get out of here. Dolly snorted. It's been 4 days. How long do you think you can hold on? Mo Jingshan didn't even lift his eyelids and said indifferently, "Don't let those disgusting women in again." "Oh, do you hate women so much?" Dolly smiled coldly. "Unfortunately, from now on, the task of delivering food and water to you will be handed over to that person just now. If you still don't eat or drink, I can shoot a useless piece of trash like her." With that, Dolly played with the gun in his hand, turned it around on his fingertips, and then sneered at Mo Jingshan's expression. Chapter 293. In the evening, she still couldn't avoid the meal. This time, Jinwan couldn't avoid it by burning her hand. Akib asked Dolly to follow her from morning to night, and the only thing Jinwan could do was to observe Dolly's habits. Dolly drank some wine at lunch and dinner every day, but he didn't drink too much, take a nap, or get drunk, and give others any chance to escape. He was such a cautious and self-disciplined person. No wonder Akib trusted him so much. The old woman had retreated the gauze on Jinwan's hand, but it was still not a professional way. The burn on the back of Jinwan's hand was mixed with the color of herbal ash, which looked even more terrible. Fortunately, it was wrapped in white gauze, or she couldn't bear to look at it. As soon as Jinwan appeared in Mo Jingshan's cabin, she saw the man who had been sitting by the wall during the day was now standing in front of the window, leaning against the wooden windowsill, coldly glancing at her who had just walked in. He could still stand up. It seemed that the water she forced into him in the morning had worked. At least he was not completely dehydrated. Dolly and the group of people stood outside as usual watching. Jinwan silently carried the wooden tray in, took out the 2 bowls inside, and then looked at Mo Jingshan, telling him to eat with her eyes. Mo Jingshan stood there motionlessly, just looking at her. There was a light black in his eyes, cold and bright. When Dolly stared at Jinwan, Mo Jingshan's eyes were deep and dark with a dangerous warning. Jinwan understood. He told her to behave, not to try to save him here, and not to make any suspicious movements. He was telling her to protect herself first. Jinwan calmly looked at the food on the table, picked up the chopsticks and bowls, and walked up to him. Mo Jingshan looked at her and didn't move. Jinwan thought that if she hadn't been caught here, she might have been able to stay with Feng Ling and Nan Heng and wait for the best time to rescue him. Now, since she was already eating, she was completely on the same rope as him. Her first priority was not to protect herself, but to let him eat. She had persisted for 4 days. If she didn't eat or drink anymore, her child would have no father. As Jinwan approached with the bowl, Mo Jingshan's gaze grew colder and colder. Jinwan knew that the 2 of them were facing a dead end. It was his fault whether he ate the food or not, but if he was forced to eat it, at least he could be forgiven. After all, Mo Jingshan's strength should be no match for hers. If she really wanted to force him to eat it, he couldn't stop her. Dolly didn't think it was strange. She scooped a mouthful of rice with her chopsticks and placed it by his mouth. The man was still the same as when he drank water in the morning. He pursed his lips and stood there silently. Jinwan tried hard to make a few more gestures at him. In fact, she was making gestures for Dolly to see. She was telling him that if he didn't eat, she would be killed. Then she put her palms together and begged him to eat. Dolly didn't know what to say. Instead, she put her palms together and begged him to eat. Mo Jingshan looked at her coldly and suddenly sneered. He took a chair in the cabin and sat down. After sitting down, he still didn't say a word. It was as if an extreme mime was being performed in this large room. It was silent, but there were countless hidden sharpness. If the acting wasn't done well, the show would be ruined, and the actors would die. Jinwan took a mouthful of rice and chewed it in her mouth. Then she opened her mouth and made an ah sound like a mute, as though telling him that the rice was very clean, that she had made it herself, and that it was not poisonous. Mo Jingshan sat down on the wooden chair, raised his hand, and was about to knock over another bowl on the table next to him, when he was suddenly held back by a very weak force. He turned his head and saw that Jinwan's burned hand had tightly grasped the corner of his clothes. His gaze coldly moved up and looked at her. Jinwan moved her lips and carefully protected the bowl, so that it wouldn't be knocked over by him. Seeing the stalemate, she heard Dolly and the group of people outside talking and laughing in Cambodian, and from time to time, she could hear some sarcastic laughter. They had guns in their hands, and they had the power of life and death here. They could watch from outside as if they were watching a show. But Jinwan and Mo Jingshan had to put their lives on the line here. If they were not careful, they would be doomed eternally. How could she play this scene to the fullest? How could she reasonably force a man to be soft-hearted, so that he could eat? Jinwan suddenly put down the bowl in her hand, and slowly knelt down under Mo Jingshan's indifferent expression. Mo Jingshan sat on the chair, and watched her suddenly kneel down. His calm black eyes flickered, but only for a moment. He still looked at her expressionlessly, but his hand was holding the armrest of the chair at an angle that no one could see. His slender fingers clenched tighter and tighter, and his knuckles turned white, but there was no change in his expression. Jinwan cried, begged, and knelt down. Dolly was enjoying himself outside. Seeing that Mo Jingshan didn't show any intention of eating, it seemed that this woman who was caught had nothing to do with him. She might not even be a Chinese. After all, if she was his compatriot, he might have some sympathy. It seemed that Mo Jingshan was not only strong-willed but also ruthless. He couldn't even move such a beautiful and pitiful woman. Seeing that he was still unmoved, Dolly simply walked in and put the gun directly on Jinwan's head. Jinwan knelt on the ground and didn't dare to move. Dolly pointed the gun at Jinwan's forehead and said in English with a sneer, "Mr. Control, are you really not going to eat? It seems that this woman is really useless. Since you hate her so much, I'll kill her in front of you. What do you think?" Mo Jingshan smiled faintly, looked at him coldly and said in an indifferent tone, "Really?" Dolly pressed the trigger, glanced at Mo Jingshan's indifferent expression, and asked him, "Do you want to kill her or not?" Mo Jingshan lowered his eyes and didn't look at Jinwan again. He looked cold and expressionless. "Then kill her." Hearing this, Dolly narrowed his eyes. Jinwan knelt stiffly on the ground, and the black muzzle was pointed at her forehead. She didn't move, nor did Dolly, and the man sitting on the wooden chair didn't even lift his eyelids. There was a dead silence in the room for a few seconds. Suddenly, the corners of Dolly's mouth curved, and he chuckled in a low voice. He suddenly withdrew the gun and put it back to his waist. "Mr. Control, you really don't know how to be tender to women. Even such a fair and beautiful woman can't move you." Chapter 294. Mo Jingshan looked at this scene, his eyes calm. Dolly smiled again and let go of Jinwan's chin. It was not until she was taken out of the house by the people outside that Jinwan realized that she seemed to have dodged another bullet. It seemed that in this kind of place, it was not only about IQ, but also about who was more stable. No wonder Feng Ling said that Mo Jingshan once only needed one decision to make these people lose billions of dollars. Judging from Mo Jingshan's ability to figure out all the thoughts of the enemy, and even accurately grasp all the psychological activities and changes of the enemy, Dolly had clearly lost in front of him. Mo Jingshan had long seen through their plan. Jinwan was just trying her best to cooperate with them, but it was Mo Jingshan who really controlled the overall situation. He was too relaxed all the time. As a result, Jinwan calmed down a lot. She believed that as long as she lived one more hour or one more day, there would be a greater chance for them to get out of here alive. Just like this, Jinwan spent another night peacefully, but this night was particularly long. On the first night here, she was really more afraid than calm. After all, as a person living in the peaceful world of High City, she had never had such an experience of her fate being controlled by others at any time. It was no exaggeration to say that she lived in a place where blood flowed from the edge of a knife. Tonight, she was a little more relaxed because she knew that everything should be under Mo Jingshan's control. Time passed slowly and torturously. The kerosene lamp in the cabin had burned out. Jinwan sat in the cabin in a daze, then lay on the bed and carefully tossed and turned. The old woman was a light sleeper because of her old age, and the slightest movement would wake her up, so Jinwan moved very gently. In the dead of night, the people on duty in the camp were sitting on the ground to take a nap, but each of them was holding a gun in their hand. Jinwan suddenly wanted to go to the bathroom. For the past 2 days, the old woman had accompanied her to the jungle to find a safe place, and there were people guarding not far away, which was very embarrassing. Now the old woman was asleep. Jinwan carefully got up from the wooden bed and tiptoed out of the cabin. Seeing the 2 people on duty outside the cabin leaning against the trunk and sleeping soundly, Jinwan held her breath and went all the way out. It took her more than 10 minutes to find a suitable place to go to the bathroom, and she almost got lost. In the meantime, she had also successfully evaded the sight of the other 2 patrolling soldiers in the camp. The forest outside was dense, and the leaves and branches covered the sky. The lush greenery blocked out most of the moonlight, and the sounds of insects and birds could be heard in the hot and stuffy air. When Jin Wan was about to go back, she stopped after walking more than 10 meters. Ever since she was captured and brought here, she had never come out alone. Even though this place was not far from the barracks, she finally had a taste of freedom. She turned around and walked forward aimlessly. Although it was possible for her to escape now, Emo Jingshan was still here. She couldn't leave on her own. Suddenly, she felt a tingling pain on her calf. She thought she was bitten by a snake that often roamed in the forest. She looked down and found that she had accidentally tripped on a thorn. Fortunately, it wasn't a snake. Jinwan did not stop. She endured the pain and continued walking. When she was further away from the camp, she suddenly noticed that the grass in front of her seemed to have been turned over. The ground was not as dense as it seemed. Her footsteps faltered. Could this be the minefield they were talking about? However, at this moment, Jinwan seemed to hear a strange noise in the distance. It was a bit like the sound of helicopter propellers that she had seen on TV before, gradually approaching. A helicopter? Was it Fengling and Nanheng? Jinwan's eyes lit up, and she raised her head abruptly. But the leaves in the dense forest were too dense to see anything. But if she could hear the sound of the helicopter, the patrolling soldiers in the camp must have heard it too. She was not sure what was going on inside. Those people should not be able to find her for the time being. But Emo Jingshan was still there. Without thinking, Jinwan abruptly turned around and walked straight back. As soon as she returned to the vicinity of the camp, she clearly sensed that all the patrolling and watchmen had already stood up. The security of the entire camp was even tighter than during the day, and the number of patrolling and sentries had suddenly increased by a lot. When Jinwan returned, the old woman happened to come out in a hurry to find her. Seeing her come back, she asked her a lot of questions. Jinwan innocently pointed to the place where the old woman had taken her to go to the bathroom. The old woman remembered that she drank a lot of water before going to bed at night, and understood. She took her back to the cabin quickly, so that she wouldn't be affected by those people outside. That night, the camp was already in a state of panic. After the sound of the helicopter rang out once, it suddenly disappeared. An hour later, the sound of the helicopter suddenly approached again. Just as everyone was on guard and prepared for the airdrop, the sound disappeared again. Everyone in the camp did not sleep until dawn. They were on high alert, but they did not see a single helicopter come in even though they had been on guard all night. Akib was a very cunning and cautious man. His men were all big and tough, and without exception, they were all ruthless. But even if they were ruthless, they were all human beings and had to rest. Akib and his men knew that the people outside must be deliberately interrupting their rest again and again, not giving them time to recuperate, and every time they took off, they would scout the situation in the dense forest. But in this case, they had to endure it. These people were all in good physical condition, and they wouldn't be affected too much even if they didn't sleep for a night. But after being played like this again and again, it was inevitable that some people would be dissatisfied. After being played by the helicopter several times, when they heard the sound again, a small number of people simply didn't move at all, and continued to sit there with their eyes closed to rest. However, this operation involved new and old grievances with 11 base, and with Emo Jingshan's help, even though they were already angry, they didn't dare to take it lightly. Jinwan got up in the morning, and continued to deliver food to them with the old woman. When they were eating, she walked to the back with the old woman. Dolly didn't follow her this time. What happened to Emo Jingshan yesterday was enough to make Dolly temporarily relieved. Taking advantage of this opportunity to deliver food to Emo Jingshan as usual, Jinwan walked alone to the cabin in the depths of the camp. Chapter 295. The moment she entered the door, the figure in the black shirt on the wooden chair didn't move. As she hurriedly approached, he opened his eyes. His deep black eyes fell on her face. Without Dolly's supervision, Jinwan hurriedly ran up to Emo Jingshan, handed him the water in the tray, and whispered, "Fengling and Nanheng will be here soon. There will be a war here. Those people have been harassed by the sound of the helicopter. No one can see them now. You need strength. Drink some water." Jinwon hadn't said a word for more than 2 days. Her voice was a little hoarse, but he could hear her clearly. Mo Jingshan lowered his eyes and looked at Jinwon's hand, which was still wrapped in white cloth. At this time, he had no time to ask her why she came to Cambodia, and why she was caught here. When he saw her fingers were redder and swollen than yesterday, a cold look flashed across his face. At the same time, Mo Jingshan's eyes turned cold and he said in a low voice, "Someone is coming." Jinwon, who was about to feed him water, suddenly paused, took a step back, held the bowl with both hands, and continued to stand there timidly, as if asking him to eat. Hearing that Jinwon came to deliver food early in the morning as he asked, Dolly took the time to come over and take a look. Outside the door, he saw Jinwon trembling in fear, and then glanced at Mo Jingshan. Mo Jingshan sat there without a trace of expression on his face. The water and food in the bowl were still untouched. There was no time to keep an eye on this woman today. After saying a few words to the people outside the wooden house, Dolly turned back to Akib with a cold face. But at this time, the people outside had already fixed their eyes on them. Jinwon calmly looked up at Mo Jingshan. The sound of the helicopter was getting closer and closer. It had never been so close last night. The camp was in a mess. Seeing Jinwon standing in the room without speaking or moving, and Mo Jingshan's face was cold, the men outside the room saw Jinwon standing in the room without speaking or moving, and Mo Jingshan's face was cold. After watching for a while, they took their guns to go to the front to see what was going on, leaving only 2 men outside. But they also looked inside for a long time and couldn't see anything, so they didn't pay special attention to the movements inside. Jinwon stared at Mo Jingshan. When she saw the man nod silently, she abruptly pushed open the door and ran out, screaming in a panic. As she ran, she pointed at the roar of the approaching helicopters in the sky, as if she were frightened. The 2 men guarding outside saw her desperately running out. In this situation, anyone who had nothing to do with their gang was very suspicious. Seeing that she ran, the 2 men simply raised their guns and aimed in her direction, planning to kill her directly to avoid future trouble. Just as the 2 of them focused on aiming at Jinwon, they didn't notice the man coming out of the wooden house behind them, nor did they notice that the man was holding 2 hard stone bowls in his hands. The bowls immediately hit the most vulnerable part of their necks. When the 2 of them came to their senses and were about to raise their guns back, it was too late. Because of the dull pain in the back of their necks and the momentary numbness in their heads, their movements slowed down a lot. In the blink of an eye, the 2 guns were snatched away by the man. Then he bent his arm and hit their eyes and abdomen hard with his elbow. The 2 of them had no time to resist and were pressed to the ground. The 2 of them lay on the ground, shouting a lot of words, but they couldn't raise their voices, so they couldn't call for help from the people in front of the camp. They didn't expect that this person who hadn't eaten for 4 or 5 days still had strength. Jinwon didn't run far. If she ran too far and was found by the people in front, she would only alert the enemy. Noticing Mo Jingshan's situation, she suddenly turned and ran back. Fortunately, she had specially taken 2 polished stone bowls from the cooking tent today. The bowls used here were all rough wood bowls and stone bowls. When Dolly was watching her, she had always taken the safe wooden bowls. Today, when Dolly was not with them, and the old woman was not paying attention, she secretly took the stone bowls. It turned out that they really came in handy. As soon as she rushed back, she saw Mo Jingshan put the guns on the heads of the 2 men. The man's black shirt was a little wrinkled, and his hair was slightly messy. He hadn't taken care of his appearance for many days. His stubble was faintly visible, but his eyes were as sharp as blades, dark and piercingly cold. Jinwon hadn't seen Mo Jingshan holding a gun, but in this environment full of desperados, whoever had a gun could protect himself. She paused, abruptly picked up 2 palm-sized stones on the ground, ran over, and smashed them hard on the heads of the 2 men. Seeing that they were knocked unconscious, she let out a long breath. When she raised her eyes again, she saw Mo Jingshan raise his eyes. He didn't speak, but just stared at her. "I think they just fainted," Jinwon said with some uncertainty. She hadn't killed anyone, but these 2 stones should be very powerful. Not to mention they were hit on the head. Even if they didn't die, they should be disabled. Mo Jingshan withdrew his gaze. Seeing that the two men were really motionless, he stood up. But when he walked out of the cabin, the strength he had accumulated for a long time could only last for a while. After all, he hadn't eaten for 4 or 5 days, so he staggered when he got up. Jinwan quickly stepped forward to grab his arm and help him up. The man slowly stood up, checked the remaining bullets in the 2 guns in his hands, and stuffed one of them into Jinwan's sleeve. Jinwan's white dress had no pockets, and only the wide sleeves could barely hold some things. "How are you?" Jinwan couldn't care about anything else but stared at his pale face. But even though he hadn't eaten for several days, she could still feel the strength of the man's body as she held his arm. Mo Jingshan didn't answer, but just took a deep look at her. Listening to the roar that was getting closer and closer, he asked, "Why are you here?" The fear and grievance she had hidden in her heart for so many days almost burst out with his belated question. Jinwan held back her tears and glared at him resentfully. "You asked me to wait for you to come back, and you said you would take me back to High City, but you didn't go at all. Since you didn't go, I had to come to you." She said it easily. How could she come to a place like Cambodia so easily? "Jinwan." The man looked at her seriously. Now he had no time to argue with her why she came to Cambodia, nor did he have time to ask her why she was caught here. He said seriously, "From now on, follow me closely. When Nan Hung and his men arrive, immediately leave with them. You must be obedient and can't be willful, understand?" Jinwan wanted to say that if she went with them, what would he do? Would he stay and deal with these fugitives? Chapter 296. This place could be bombarded by helicopters at any time. Mo Jingshan was about to take Jinwan to the dense forest behind. Hearing her words, he suddenly turned to look at her. Seeing that the man suddenly stared at her without saying a word, his long and deep gaze falling on her, she was afraid that he would think she was joking, so she raised her hand and grabbed his arm hard, saying clearly, "You didn't hear wrong, Mo Jingshan. I'm pregnant." The man stood in front of her without moving. Jinwan had wanted to use the pregnancy to make him feel a little better, but from his cold eyes, she could tell that he was not only not happy, but also wanted to scold her. She was pregnant, yet she still came to this kind of place. Indeed, she needed a lesson. Jinwan was very self-aware and complained in her heart. Before he could speak, she suddenly stood on tiptoe and hugged his neck, pulling his body down. "Don't be angry. Even if I'm about to give birth, I won't be able to stay in High City and wait for you to come back. Mo Jingshan, if I'm in your shoes and I'm in danger, you'll definitely want to stand on the same land as me as soon as possible. Don't drive me away. Although I've been suffering a little humiliation here for the past 2 days, at least I survived and didn't get hurt. I won't die, and neither will you." Mo Jingshan's eyes were as dark as ink. He raised his hand to hold the woman in his arms who had vowed to stand on the same land as him, and his arms tightened. In this kind of environment, there was no obvious surprise or joy. There was only a silent embrace that hugged her very, very tightly. Finally in his arms, after days of hesitation and fear, she finally found her sense of belonging. "Since you're here, how can I drive you away?" The man's voice was low and husky by her ear. His light breath passed through her hair, and he kissed her temple. "But you must be obedient and listen to my arrangements at any time. Don't force yourself. Do you hear me?" Jinwan nodded in his arms. Hearing the sound of the helicopter approaching, Mo Jingshan decisively took Jinwan's hand and dragged her into the dense forest behind the cabin. "Stand here and don't move. If there's a bombing, don't go out and run around. They won't bomb a large area. They will only throw things down in a small area to distract these people. Some of the smoke bombs contain smoke and dust, and it will dissipate in 10 minutes. Mo Jingshan brought Jinwan to a small puddle in the forest, and was about to take off his shirt. Jinwan immediately understood what he meant. She hurriedly pressed his hand down, and took off the white cloth wrapped around her hand. Anyway, it was useless to keep the white cloth wrapped around her hand. After taking it off, she turned around and dipped it in the puddle. Then, she folded it, and made a gesture of covering her mouth and nose. She then asked him, "Is that what you mean?" Mo Jingshan gave her a look of approval, but when he saw the severely burned skin on the back of her hand, he was silent for 2 seconds before saying, "Stand there and don't move. Wait for me to come back. Wait for me." These 4 words again. Jinwan subconsciously reached out and grabbed his wrist. "What are you going to do? I'll go with you. Don't you remember what I said just now?" Mo Jingshan turned to look at her. "Listen to me at any time. Don't force yourself." "Mo Jingshan, I'm already standing with you in such a dangerous place. Where else can I hide? Instead of letting me face the fear of not knowing how long I'll have to wait for you, why don't you let me follow you?" The man looked out indifferently. Although this place wouldn't be affected by the things dropped by the helicopter, Jinwan might face unknown danger at any time. Not to mention that this place was not far from the minefield. Once the desperados in the camp fled in this direction, they would soon find her. In this dense forest, there was no absolutely safe place. Whether she went with him or stayed alone, she might face unknown danger at any time. After hesitating for only 2 seconds, the man took her wrist and led her out. Jinwan relaxed. She held the cloth that had just been soaked in the puddle in one hand, and held his hand with the other. The camp was now ready to go. Akib and Dolly were calmly arranging every mission. From the beginning, they laid an ambush layer by layer here to suddenly being surrounded by so many helicopters. It only took a blink of an eye. Although measures had been laid to prevent helicopters from coming in and besieging them, they didn't expect that there would be so many helicopters. Nor did they expect that the American police would come to support them. They really underestimated Mo Jingshan's influence in the eyes of those Americans. If there were only those people from 11 Base, they could try their best, but now so many helicopters had come prepared, and his men hadn't had a rest since last night. Their odds of winning had dropped from 100% to less than 50%. Jinwan and Mo Jingshan were outside their patrol area. She had been standing behind him, so she could only quietly poke her head out to look over there. She was more worried about Mo Jingshan's physical strength. How long could he hold on? Although there were many helicopters, they couldn't land immediately. During this period of waiting, the 2 of them were in the most dangerous situation. The cabin where Mo Jingshan lived had been searched by them. They couldn't go back, or they would be killed. Just as the 2 of them moved to the back of another cabin, suddenly, Mo Jingshan looked through the window of the cabin in front of him, and saw that one of the patrolling men had found them, and was quietly loading a gun. He pulled Jinwan, and pushed her into the gap behind the haystack on the side of the cabin. "Lie down. Don't make a sound." Mo Jingshan quickly pressed the haystack on Jinwan, and held the gun at his waist, keeping an inconspicuous distance from the haystack, where Jinwan was hiding as fast as possible. But in an instant, the man on the opposite side had come around from the side, raised his gun, and aimed at Mo Jingshan. The other patrolling men didn't notice this direction. Only this man raised the long gun in his hand, and aimed at him as if to claim credit. Mo Jingshan looked at him calmly. The man's gun was obviously much more powerful than the one in his hand. The man looked at him and smiled, surprised to see Mo Jingshan standing here alone. He asked in English, "Mr. Control, do you really think we dare not kill you? Now we have been surrounded by your men. You are no longer a threatening trump card in our hands. I can kill you at any time." Chapter 297. The man suddenly looked around and finally fixed his eyes on the tall haystack in the corner of the cabin, and the gap behind it that could accommodate a person. Mo Jingshan paused because of the man's gaze. He suddenly took the gun from his waist, threw it to the ground, and raised one hand above his head. The man's attention immediately returned to Mo Jingshan. Seeing him throw the gun away, he immediately smiled. But Mo Jingshan had always been dangerous, and they all knew how unfathomable he was. Even so, they didn't dare to approach him, but just pointed the gun at his head. As long as he dared to move, they could shoot him at any time. At this moment, another man patrolling the cabin noticed the movement here. When he came over, he saw this scene, and exchanged a look with the previous man. The 2 of them stood there with guns at the same time. Jinwan lay in the haystack, looking at the scene a few meters away with a pale face. But Emo Jingshan stood there calmly and didn't even look in her direction. Although these desperados were loyal to Akib, they were still desperados. They would try their best to gain the most benefits for themselves. So they were now considering whether to kill Emo Jingshan or bring him to Akib to claim credit for it. Emo Jingshan knew what they were thinking, but he didn't move. Besides, Jinwan was in the haystack not far away. No matter how careful the plan was, it couldn't be more important than her safety and her words. Emo Jingshan, I'm pregnant. At this moment, he couldn't afford to gamble. Suddenly, the man who came later found a corner of the white dress under the haystack. The white dress was given to her by the old woman. It didn't fit her very well and was very long. No matter how hard she tried to hide, the color of the white dress couldn't be hidden too well in the haystack, and there would always be a touch of white that caught their attention. The man narrowed his eyes and pointed the gun at the haystack. Emo Jingshan's temples were throbbing. These people were extremely vicious. If they pointed their guns at him, he could at least fight for a chance of survival. But when it came to Jinwan, he was in danger of shooting at any time. Just as he was about to shoot, Emo Jingshan abruptly moved his feet. The gun that had been thrown to the ground was instantly hooked up and returned to his hands. Seeing that he was about to shoot, the man who came first, not deciding whether to kill him or exchange him for benefits, abruptly pointed his gun at the haystack. Seeing that Emo Jingshan was silent, he did not move rashly. Put the gun down. It was obvious that the person in the haystack was very important to him. The man raised his voice and threatened him. The person who came later suddenly said in a low voice, "Why don't we just kill him first, just in case?" "Okay, come at me." Emo Jingshan threw the gun down again. This time, he threw it at their feet. The two men laughed as though they had succeeded. One of them stepped forward and kicked Emo Jingshan's knee. Emo Jingshan knelt heavily on one knee. At the same time, the man hit the back of his head with the butt of the gun. In an instant his face turned stiff and pale, but in order not to frighten the woman in the haystack, he didn't make a sound. Emo Jingshan's voice was very low. Even so, Jinwan could still hear the danger in it. This place has been surrounded and may be bombed at any time. Instead of pledging allegiance to Akib and becoming a desperado with him, why don't you let me go? I'll fight for a chance of survival with 11 base and the police. There was a brief silence. The two men were hesitating. Indeed, they really didn't expect that the American police, who were usually the most difficult to mobilize, would arrive so quickly and spend so many combat resources on so many helicopters. If they delayed any longer, they would really be waiting to be surrounded and annihilated. The cold muzzle was pressed against Emo Jingshan's head. The eyes of the man who came first were full of hesitation, but the eyes of the man who came later were full of killing intent. He didn't believe that they would really leave a chance of survival if they let him go. At the same time, Jinwan in the haystack knew that she couldn't hide anymore. She felt a strong stick in the haystack, which was probably firewood that had not been split. She held the stick tightly in her hand and slowly prepared to get up. While they were not all paying attention to her, she almost jumped out of the haystack and knocked the man closest to the haystack to the ground. As she rushed over, she hit the wrist of the man in front of her hard with the stick in her hand and knocked the gun out of his hand. The two of them were knocked to the ground by a woman who came out of the haystack, and the gun fell to the side. Emo Jingshan picked up the gun almost immediately, but when he raised his head, the man who fell to the ground first had quickly jumped up and pressed the gun against Jinwan's head. The man grabbed Jinwan's arm and pressed the gun against her temple. He stared at Emo Jingshan coldly. "Let's have a try. Let's see who is faster." The gun against Jinwan's temple was cold. It was a long cold black gun that Jinwan had never seen in High City, or even on TV, glowing with a cold black light. He threatened Emo Jingshan to throw the gun away, but Emo Jingshan held the gun tightly and pointed it at his head, not letting go. The man suddenly sneered and said in Jinwan's ear, "It seems that Mr. Control doesn't care about women. You pretended to be mute and lurked here for 2 or 3 days, but he doesn't even care about your life." The trigger in his hand was slightly pressed, and with a click, it was pressed against her temple. Jinwan's whole body tightened. Emo Jingshan's eyes flickered, and his heart almost stopped beating. At this moment he finally let go. He slowly bent down and put the gun on the ground. At this time, the other man had also stood up. He took the opportunity to step forward and pick up the gun again. First, he stepped on Mo Jingshan's hand to the ground. Then he turned around and slapped Jin Won hard in the face, cursing her, "Bitch." His wrist bone was almost broken by her strike just now. It was so King painful. He was very cruel and didn't show any mercy to her because she was a woman. Jin Won's head jerked to one side, and her whole body trembled. Her cheeks quickly swelled up, and the pain numbed her. She could feel that her mouth was broken by her teeth, and the salty liquid spread on the tip of her tongue. Because of the violent movement, her tied-up hair fell down, covering half of her swollen face. She swallowed the blood and didn't say a word, letting her hair cover her face. In this way, Mo Jingshan couldn't see. As long as he couldn't see. Chapter 298. At the same time, the man who had been holding Jin Won suddenly lifted her hair, stared at her for a moment and smiled. 2 days ago, Akib had said that he wanted everyone to have a taste of her. At that time, he didn't have the chance to get too close to her. He only knew that this girl was pretty. Now he felt that her skin was soft and tender, and she was very beautiful. In particular, her pair of red eyes had a stubborn and unyielding look, which made people want to conquer her. "You risked your life to sneak into our place. Who is Mr. Control to you?" The man suddenly pinched Jin Won's waist through her white dress. "Is he your man?" Jin Won looked at him coldly and didn't speak. "Now your lives are in our hands. Even if I press you down here and *CK you until you cry, I'm afraid your Mr. Control can only watch," the man said and leaned over to kiss her on the cheek. Mo Jingshan struggled to get up, but was kicked in the knee and knocked hard to the ground. He tried to get up again, but the man hit him on the back with the butt of the gun and knocked him hard against a corner of the cabin. Jin Won watched his back hit hard against the corner of the cabin, and at the same time, the man hit him hard with the gun at his waist. These people were vicious. Mo Jingshan hadn't eaten for several days. It was a miracle that he could hold on until now. Without a gun in his hand, he couldn't fight back at all. Mo Jingshan gritted his teeth and said word by word, "Let her go, and I'll go with you. My life can be exchanged for hundreds of millions of dollars at any time. Her existence is of no benefit to you." The man who had just attacked him laughed even more happily. "It seems that you care about this woman very much. Why, is she really your woman?" Mo Jingshan was pressed hard against the wall outside the cabin. Jin Won was pushed to the ground by another man, and the muzzle was still aimed at her temple. The man unhurriedly pinched Jin Won's chin and suddenly began to tear her clothes. Jin Won's white dress was not very thick or cumbersome. In an instant, one side of her shoulder was directly exposed to the air, and her snow-white and delicate skin dazzled the man's eyes. He looked at her greedily. "It looks good. I wonder how it tastes." The disgusting man pressed against her, but she didn't struggle as violently as before. She looked up calmly and said in English, "Let him go. I'll play alone with you too." The man on top of her looked at her and was stunned for a moment. Then he laughed. "What's the point of him leaving? I like doing it in front of your man." Jin Won lay there motionless, her heart dead silent. From the moment she was caught, she knew that she might not be able to leave. She was already very fortunate to see Mo Jingshan again in such a place. All the regrets she had missed in her previous life were no longer regrets at this moment. At the very least, she finally saw the complete Mo Jingshan. The Mo Jingshan she did not understand, but the Mo Jingshan was so good. To be able to go through life and death with him at this moment. Perhaps God had given her a chance to love properly and cherish the man she had missed in her previous life. As someone who had died once, it was not that she was not afraid of death, but at this moment, Jin Won was calmer than she thought. At worst, she could bite her tongue and commit suicide. It was not like she had never died before. Perhaps she had more experience than anyone in how to die happily. She just wanted Mo Jingshan to get out of danger. She didn't want to drag him down because of herself. Either way, death was inevitable. Jin Won could only remain calm. There was no need to struggle. The man had already kissed her face again. She moved her head slightly, and his dark and dirty skin formed a sharp contrast with Jin Wan's fair face. The smell of sweat on the man's body mixed with the smell of blood. Jin Wan felt that her morning sickness was going to break out again, and she wanted to vomit. She resisted and said calmly, "With someone watching, I'll be nervous and won't be able to let go. If I don't let him go, you won't feel happy, will you?" Mo Jingshan, who was pressed against the side of the cabin, clenched his fist so hard that his fingertips dug into his palms, and his knuckles turned blue and white. Every cell in his body was screaming for him to shoot this bastard. He tried his best to restrain the urge to jump up. His eyes were red, but when the man in front of him was also looking at Jin Wan with a smile, he reached out to pick up the stick that Jin Wan had thrown on the ground. Because Jin Wan was too calm, the two men's attention was on her, and their movements revealed some flaws. The sky seemed to be covered with fog by the approaching helicopter, and the sun in the sky seemed to have been set on fire. Just as the man lying on Jin Wan was about to tear her clothes down, Mo Jingshan suppressed his anger and almost used all his strength to hit the man who was holding him down, knocking him out completely. The man didn't even have the chance to scream or struggle, and fell to the ground with a muffled sound. Without any hesitation, Mo Jingshan leaped forward and hit the man who was pulling her clothes. The man had only raised his gun halfway when he was hit in the head. Mo Jingshan rushed up with the intention to kill the two men. The two of them immediately fell to the ground with blood all over their heads. They looked even more miserable than the two guards in front of the wooden hut. Jin Wan hurriedly sat up in embarrassment. She looked up and was a little stunned to see that the once aloof, calm, and self-controlled man was now as fierce as a trapped beast. He threw down the stick and punched the man, who had just pounced on her in the face. One punch after another, the man had already passed out and his face was covered with bruises. Finally, he let go of the dying man, picked up the gun from the ground, and aimed it at him. He pulled the trigger. Seeing that he was going to kill him, Jin Wan rushed up and pressed his hand hard. Feng Ling said, "Your hands are clean, and you didn't do anything. You can't kill people for me. Even if these people deserve to die, Mo Jingshan shouldn't be the one whose hands were stained with blood." She couldn't let this man, who had always been pure and handsome, fall into the mud for her. "I'll avenge myself." Jin Wan struggled to stand up. She didn't know how to use a long-barreled gun. Besides, if she really fired it here, it would instantly attract the attention of the people in front. She picked up the stick on the ground and hit the unconscious man back and forth, as if she was whipping a corpse. In the end, she deliberately hit the base of his leg. The unconscious man cried out in pain, and blood flowed from his lower body. Dash. Chapter 299. There was blood all over the ground. She couldn't tell whose it was. Mo Jingshan's black shirt hid the color of the blood, but she knew he had been injured just now. And he was seriously injured. Every part of the butt of the gun was hard and sharp. His back and head must have been riddled with scars. On the narrow, damp land behind the cabin, there was a moment of silence because of the two people who had fallen on the ground. Fortunately, Jin Wan's shirt had an elastic collar at the shoulder, so it was not torn when it was pulled down. Mo Jingshan tugged the shirt on her shoulder up heavily, took her into his arms without a word, and hugged her hard. He hugged her hard, very hard. Almost as soon as the two people fell to the ground, there was a burst of noise in front of them. The helicopters finally surrounded this place tightly. As Mo Jingshan said, a lot of things had been dropped. Mo Jingshan let go of Jin Wan, held her wrist, and pulled her to a place where they would not be hit by the smoke bombs. Mo Jingshan held her tightly. Without saying a word or looking at her again, he pulled her back to the jungle heavily. Her hands, which had been scalded to the point of almost festering, were in so much pain that she felt as if her heart was being torn apart. But Jin Wan endured it without saying a word. She knew this pain was not as painful as the pain he felt when he was pressed under someone's body and almost raped. Jin Wan didn't ask him to be gentle. She knew that this man, who had always been rational, had lost his mind at this time. She followed him quietly. In front of her was this man, and she could smell his scent. As long as he was still here, nothing was difficult for her. Behind him, she didn't know what to say, because his entire body seemed to be burning with fire. She was a little afraid, and didn't know how to coax him. She couldn't even say, "I'm really fine." She had never seen Emo Jingshan like this before. He could have resisted and escaped, but he didn't. He threw the gun away. He would rather be beaten, and face the danger of being shot at any time. Why? Of course it was to protect her. But she had nowhere to hide. Instead of lying in the haystack, and watching him with a gun pointed at his head, she would rather rush out. Live and die together? She hadn't thought about it. She only knew that he was Emo Jingshan, her husband, her man, the father of the child in her belly, and the bright light that had guided her in both her past and present lives. Nothing must happen to him. As they walked into the forest, the two of them did not say a word. The smoke bombs began to fall, and the people who were completely surrounded fled in all directions. Jinwan put the damp cloth to her nose, and turned to look at Emo Jingshan. She covered her nose and mouth. What should he do? With us here, they won't release any poisonous smoke. As long as you don't breathe too hard, it won't be a problem. It will only cause panic in these people. But now that you're pregnant, you should avoid these gases as much as possible. He didn't look at her, but he answered the question in her mind. Seeing that Jinwan at least knew to cover her mouth and nose at this time, Emo Jingshan's anger gradually calmed down a little, but only a little. He regained his senses and slowly let go of her wrist, when he felt the uneven scalded skin in his palm. However, he couldn't bear to look at her eyes that were already red from the pain. "Stand here." He paused and didn't say that she hated waiting for him to come back. His tone was cold. "I won't go too far." His voice was extremely cold. If Jinwan still followed him out now, he might really lose control. Jinwan stood where she was and didn't speak. Emo Jingshan stubbornly clung onto the last bit of rationality that was about to be burnt out. Her silence only caused the killing intent in his heart to increase. He abruptly walked out. Jinwan stood there as he said, didn't move, and didn't follow him at all. She saw Emo Jingshan pick up the gun on the ground. When he straightened up, Jinwan accurately caught a flash of hesitation on his face, which was obviously in pain. His back, his head, and the places she couldn't see were all covered with wounds. Standing in the dense forest, looking at the dense mass of helicopters flying over, she narrowed her eyes and didn't move. She was a little uneasy, because she couldn't see the situation in the camp. But Emo Jingshan didn't go far. He seemed to have figured out all the places in the camp before she did, and was walking toward the front of the camp. Soon, the helicopter landed on an open space closest to Jinwan. It seemed that Emo Jingshan had known this would be the best place to land. A middle-aged man in an American police uniform quickly got off the helicopter. When he saw Jinwan, who was not deliberately hiding in the dense forest, he walked up to her with a gun, thinking that she was an accomplice of these people, because she was wearing the white dress of the women in this area. "Who are you?" The policeman looked at her cautiously and seriously. Jinwan opened her mouth. Although her face was a little dirty, her pure Asian image should be recognized by these people. She raised her hand to wipe her face and said calmly in English, "I'm Chinese. I'm Emo Jingshan's wife." Hearing the words Emo Jingshan's wife, the American policeman was puzzled but obviously didn't believe her. At this moment, the door of a black helicopter that landed behind them opened, and Feng Ling rushed out and hurried over. "Mrs. Emo." Hearing Feng Ling's voice, the policeman hesitated and slowly put down the gun. Feng Ling quickly stepped forward and grabbed Jinwan's hand. "Mrs. Emo, how are you? I'm sorry we're late. We've been waiting for this batch of helicopters to rescue us. After all, the ambush here is very deep. If we don't make thorough preparations, we're likely to fail, but we've been delayed for 2 days. You must have suffered." Before she finished speaking, she suddenly looked down at the back of Jinwan's hand and frowned. Without asking more questions, she pulled Jinwan back to the helicopter. "How did your hand get hurt like this? There's a medicine box on the helicopter. Let me help you." "I'm fine." As Jinwan was pulled away by Feng Ling, she turned to look in the direction of Emo Jingshan's departure. "Where is Emo Jingshan? Mr. Emo should go to meet Nan Hung now. Don't worry, Nanhang's plane arrived earlier than us. Now the front has been controlled. The minefield in this dense forest is likely to be detonated by those fleeing people. You're pregnant and can't smell the smoke. It's easy to hurt the baby. Hurry up and get on the helicopter. Chapter 300. The helicopter didn't fly as slowly and steadily as a regular plane. When it took off, Jinwan couldn't hold back her morning sickness anymore. Even if she wanted to ask Mo Jingshan when he would get out of danger with them, she couldn't ask. Because as soon as the helicopter took off, Jinwan ran to the toilet in the bathroom and vomited for a long time. In the end, she knelt by the toilet and lost all her strength. She hadn't eaten much these days, but because she was pregnant and couldn't lack nutrition, she insisted on eating as much as possible, but she didn't eat much. Now she vomited all the food she had eaten in the past few days. When she was pressed to the ground by that disgusting man, she wanted to vomit, and had been holding back until now. Mrs. Mo. Feng Ling had found the spare medicine box on the helicopter. She turned around and saw Jinwan lying by the toilet, so she reached out to help her up. Jinwan was helplessly helped out. Sitting in the cabin, Feng Ling took a cushion and put it behind her for Jinwan to lean on. Can you hold on? This helicopter is here to pick you up. Now we'll send you out. You'll feel much better after landing. Just hold on a little longer. It's just morning sickness. I don't have any disease. Jinwan leaned back weakly and looked at her with her eyes slightly open. You don't have to send me out on this helicopter. I'll wait for them with you. You can do whatever you need to do with the people in the base. I can do it alone. Feng Ling looked at her and didn't speak. She just took Jinwan's hand and quickly applied medicine on the back of her hand, asking, Is this a burn? Why is it so hot? I did it on purpose. They asked me to send him food and set up a trap. Whether he ate it or not, it would be the worst result. In order to prevent him from facing this choice, I spilled the whole pot of boiling soup on my hand, Jinwan said in a low voice. Feng Ling paused and then frowned. Perhaps you should let Mr. Mo make the decision. He must have a way to ensure that you won't be implicated. At the same time, he can protect himself. Jinwan was silent for a moment before saying, Indeed, if I had thrown this difficult problem to him, he might have handled it well. But I didn't think that much at that time, so I used the stupidest method. This isn't a stupid method. Perhaps it's because when you've reached a certain level of love, you'd rather be scarred than let the other party suffer. Mrs. Mo, you've already done very well. As Feng Ling spoke, she took out gauze to bandage Jinwan's hand. Let's deal with it this way first. Your injury is a bit too serious. I can't give you medicine casually even though you're pregnant. When you return safely, I'll deal with it properly. Jinwan raised her eyes to look at Feng Ling gratefully. Thank you. The helicopter hovered over the center of the dense camp, neither leaving nor descending. Jinwan no longer felt nauseous because of the stability. She closed her eyes and calmed down for a moment, then turned to lean against the open cabin door with Feng Ling and looked down. They didn't fly very high, so they could still see the messy crowd in the camp under the control of the police. But they didn't see Nanheng, Mo Jingshan, Akib or Dali. However, she suddenly caught a glimpse of the old woman who had fallen by the tent. The old woman was motionless. She didn't know whether she had fainted or been shot in the random gunfire. Jinwan's heart skipped a beat. This old woman had been with Akib for many years. Although she didn't know whether she was a servant or a relative of Akib, at least in the past few days, this old woman had dressed her, bandaged her hand, and protected her. But Jinwan also knew that the old woman was in poor health and couldn't work or cook. So she forced Jinwan to stay here to take over her work. Her original intention might not be good, but if it hadn't been for the old woman's occasional help these 2 days, Jinwan might have been humiliated or faced a more difficult situation. Feng Ling, do you see the old woman by the tent? Jinwan asked. Feng Ling glanced down. I see it. What happened to her? Dead. Their own people shot indiscriminately. She was killed by their own people's guns. There was a moment of silence in the air. Jinwan turned back, leaned against the cabin, and no longer looked down. After a moment of silence, she said hoarsely, If these people can leave their bodies intact, please tell them to bury this old woman well. Feng Ling didn't ask more, but turned to look at Jin Wan's dirty and blood-stained white dress, guessing that it probably belonged to the old woman. Okay. After a while, there was a commotion below. No matter which side it was, there must be a lot of casualties. Jin Wan really couldn't watch anymore. She raised her hand to cover her tumbling stomach and sat there quietly. Mrs. Mo, shall we go back? I'll wait for him here, Jin Wan insisted. At this height, they were already at a safe distance from the ground. This place wouldn't affect anyone below, so Feng Ling respected Jin Wan's choice. If she insisted on staying here with Mr. Mo, Feng Ling wouldn't force her, as long as Jin Wan's body could bear it. After all, this kind of helicopter with the cabin door open was too torturous for a pregnant woman like Jin Wan. She didn't know how much time had passed. Jin Wan had been sitting in the cabin, listening to the whirring sound of the propeller, but it gave her a great sense of security. She knew that she had broken free from the camp, where she could almost lose her life at any time. Knowing that Mo Jingxian had met up with Nan Heng and the others, she gradually relaxed. She tried not to listen to what was happening below the helicopter. Even if she heard something, she could only treat it as watching a war movie. Otherwise, she would really have nightmares if she saw such a bloody scene. She fell asleep. Time passed bit by bit, and the sun rose from the east to the center, and from the center to the west. Suddenly, she felt a slight bump in the plane. Jin Wan opened her eyes with a jerk, and the moment she turned her head, she heard Feng Ling say, Mrs. Mo, we're landing now. Okay, Jin Wan responded. He did not know when the cabin door had been closed. No wonder she was sleeping so peacefully. At this moment, Feng Ling suddenly opened the cabin door and heard her say, Mr. Mo is back. Chapter 301. What entered her nose was the refreshing scent of the man's body, mixed with bits of blood, but on his body, it was not unpleasant at all. Jin Wan did not even raise her head. She held the man's waist tightly and refused to let go. Feng Ling consciously stood by the side and did not make a sound. She nodded politely and respectfully to Mo Jingxian, who had just come in, and turned to get off the helicopter. There was a metal partition between the cabin and the cockpit. They could not see the front from here, and the pilot in the cockpit could not see them either. Mo Jingxian held the agitated little woman in his arms tightly and silently carried her in. Usually, he would carry her as though he was casually picking up a piece of clothing. But right now, the moment he straightened his back, his body trembled, and he almost lost his footing. But it did not affect him. When Jin Wan sensed his pain and was about to withdraw from his arms, he held her tightly and did not let her move away. You're injured. Jin Wan's words were no longer as calm and composed as before in the face of danger. Instead, the lingering fear had covered all her courage. Her hands tightly grasped the blood-stained shirt on his back. Now the blood had dried on his back, and the shirt was stuck to the skin on his back. Mo Jingxian lowered his eyes to look at the little woman who only now knew fear. This woman had not even changed her clothes. Aside from her hands being rebandaged, her face was still covered in dirt. Her white dress was mixed with mud and blood. She looked very disheveled, but her eyes were still clear and bright. Why didn't you let Feng Ling send you back? Mo Jingxian asked, his voice right above her head. His voice was as clear and clean as ever, but it was much hoarser and heavier because of the many days of torture. But in Jin Wan's ears, it sounded like the world depended on him. He was alive. They were all alive. They were all safe. I don't want to be so far away from you. Feng Ling said it's very safe here, and nothing will happen to you. Since it's safe, of course I don't need to leave. Jin Wan hugged him tightly, but her hands were careful not to touch his seriously injured back. When can we get out of here completely? You need to see a doctor about your injury. The man gently pulled her hand away from his waist. He lowered his eyes to see that she still had the strength to cry, and the trace of warmth between his brows instantly turned cold. He stared at her with his ink-black eyes. In the future, no matter where I am, you're not allowed to take this risk again. I told you to wait for me, so wait for me obediently. Is Cambodia a place where you can come and go as you please? As expected, the lesson that should have come had still come. Jinwon pursed her lips and did not speak. She raised her reddened eyes to look at him, as though she had turned back into the pitiful little mute who frequently brought him food these past 2 days. No matter how he glared at her, how he coldly, or how he scolded her, she did not speak. Meeting her gaze, Mo Jingshan's chest trembled. What happened today was 100 times more painful for him than for her. And it was even harder for him to get over this hurdle. The moment he thought of the scene where she was almost violated, his sky was about to collapse. He should have sent more people to guard her from the start. If one Feng Ling was not enough, he should have sent 10 more to keep a close eye on her. He could not give her any chance to take any risks. She was pregnant, yet she still dared to run to Cambodia. This woman was truly audacious. Why aren't you speaking? He forcefully controlled his expression to not be too soft-hearted. I'm waiting for you to finish lecturing me, ah. These past few days, I've indeed been shaken to the core. Only after you're done scolding me can I feel a sense of having escaped from a dragon's pool or a tiger's den. That way, I'll feel more comfortable. Mo Jingshan's gaze was quiet and dark. Will you only be satisfied when my heart jumps out of my body? Jinwon stared at him, her hands tugging at his blood-stained black shirt. I only want you to live. In that instant, he felt an unbearable piercing pain in his eyes. In the 26 years of his life, other than a few teardrops around the age of 2, when he was learning to speak, the man, who had never shed a single tear since he was 3, was almost instantly blinded by the stinging sensation. His eyes turned bloodshot. Mo Jingshan, I only want you to live. Even if you didn't come to T-City to pick me up as promised, I'll still come to find you. As long as you're alive, I can go anywhere to find you. In the sky or on the ground, in the past or present life. As long as you're around, I'll overcome all obstacles. I only want you to live. The man abruptly kissed her. There was a salty and fishy taste in his mouth. It was the taste of blood. Previously, when he was injured, he had forcefully swallowed the blood in his throat to prevent Jinwon from worrying. Jinwon took into account that she had just vomited several hours ago. Even though she had rinsed her mouth, she had not brushed her teeth for several days. Mo Jingshan did not eat or drink anything. Aside from the smell of blood, there was nothing else on him. He was as clear and clean as ever, but she felt that right now she might be stinky. She struggled in his arms, but the man kissed her even deeper. He held the back of her head tightly and circled her, as if he wanted to rub her into his body. In the past, whether it was in T-City or High City, she was a spoiled young lady who had to shower twice a day. He was also the high and mighty CEO of Mo Corporation, who was obsessed with cleanliness to a certain extent. But at this moment, throwing away the blood-stained ground and the shackles of various identities and habits, there was only him and her here. It was pure him and her. The last string of reason in Mo Jingshan's mind was almost broken by her. Reason and responsibility, marriage and kindness, and the growing strong feelings for each other could not compare to this woman, whose heart was more determined than his at this moment. He was afraid that in this life, he would really be completely buried in her hands. Gradually, Jinwon stopped struggling. Her entire body leaned into his embrace. This was compromise, this was submission, and she did not want to resist anymore. She hugged his neck tightly and took the initiative to kiss him back. Finally, the hand that was hugging the back of his neck instinctively moved to stroke his hair. Her fingers had just brushed past the back of his head when the man suddenly paused. He released her lips and gave a low moan. It was clear that he was in so much pain that he could no longer hold it in. Jinwon subconsciously rushed to put down her hand. When she lowered her head, she saw that her fingers were stained with blood. It had been several hours since Mo Jingshan's back and head were smashed by the gun, but in the morning, the blood on his back had already dried and stuck to his shirt. However, the blood on his head had not dried yet. It was clear how badly he had been smashed. Mo Jingshan pressed down her blood-stained hand. His tone was calm. It's all right. They're all external wounds. It'll be fine after we get them bandaged. Jinwon tried hard to hold back her tears. She did not want to become a burden in his heart. She sniffled and raised her eyes to look at him. She said calmly, Feng Ling left the first aid kit here. I'll help you clean your wounds, alright? You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support. And don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.